Chapter 101, Steel Skeleton, Empty Assault. Ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to inspect this slave, you may step forward, the auctioneer called, waving his hand with practiced indifference. The crowd stirred. Some bidders drifted closer to the platform where the girl, Elena, knelt in shackles. No one expected what came next. With a barely audible click, Charles's fingers crackled with restrained power. Before anyone could react, he strode onto the stage, reached up, and ripped the explosive collar from Elena's neck. In one fluid motion, he hurled it back at the auctioneer. The device detonated instantly, engulfing the stunned man in a fireball. Chaos erupted. Spectators screamed and scrambled for cover, but Charles remained unmoved. He turned toward the crowd, eyes glowing with a fierce red-green light. An invisible pressure washed over the onlookers, constricting their throats as if gripped by iron bands. One by one, they gasped, frothing at the mouth, and collapsed unconscious in a heap. When the dust settled, Elena, her collar gone and face pale, rose to her feet, bewildered. Around her lay dozens of collapsed bodies. She glanced at Charles, astonishment and relief warring in her eyes. He offered her a small, reassuring nod. In that moment, Elena knew she had witnessed Charles's unpredictable and utterly formidable power once again. Charles's overwhelming presence rippled through the auction hall like a shockwave. Everyone but Irina and the bound slaves went rigid and slumped to the floor, unconscious. The little girl among the captives stared wide-eyed at the carpet of bodies around her. Perched on the auction platform, Charles surveyed the scene with a faint, cold smile and locked eyes with Elena. "Well," he drawled, "if you really intend to free them, now's your chance. I can't promise how long they'll stay out." Below him, Elena's gaze swept over the fallen bidders, then settled on the trembling girl beside her. The child's name was Liana. Elena stepped off the stage and knelt in front of her, gently placing a hand on her head. "You're free now," Elena whispered. "Go home." Liana's big eyes filled with surprise and something deeper, a flicker of hope. She tilted her head, peering at Elena with hesitant trust. "Big sister, I don't have a home." At her words, Elena's chest tightened as if someone had struck her. She pressed her hand more firmly against Liana's hair, her expression torn between relief and sorrow. Then Elena looked up at Charles, silently pleading for a solution. Charles watched them both for a long moment. A shadow of amusement flickered across his face before he shrugged. "Fine," he said, voice cool. "She can come with us." He leapt down from the platform as Elena rose to her feet, still cradling Liana's hand. Irina hurried forward to help Elena guide the little girl away from the fallen crowd. Together, they walked out of the silent hall, liberators and freed alike, bound by a fragile new alliance. "I don't have an extra mouth to feed," Charles muttered, rolling his eyes. He strode toward the backstage area, where hidden behind the master's arrogance lay something far more disturbing. Elena gripped young Liana's hand and followed him into the gloom. The corridor was so dim that Liana could barely make out shapes. Charles paused at a bland section of wall and flicked a concealed switch. Instantly, the overhead desk lamps sputtered to life, one by one illuminating the space in harsh, unforgiving light. Elena gasped and covered her mouth. Before them lay what felt like hell on earth, rows of emaciated, bloodied men and women, their eyes glazed with numb despair. Even Charles, usually so controlled, felt his heart clench at the sight. He forced himself to look away for a moment, then squared his shoulders and turned back. Under Elena's astonished gaze, he moved from cage to cage, unlatching each door with deliberate calm. With every click, the shackled prisoners lifted their heads, their hollow expressions flickering with cautious hope as they realized the gates before them were open. At the last cage, Charles stepped back, exhaled, and called out softly, "Let's go." One by one, the freed slaves shuffled past him, emerging from the shadows into the stark light and into liberty. "Stay away from here. It's no place for you right now." Charles yanked Elena by the arm, hauling her through the backstage corridors and out of the auction house. This time, Elena offered no resistance. Clinging to one of Charles's burly guards, she let him guide her past the startled onlookers. In his other arm, Charles cradled a trembling little girl, shielding her from the hostile crowd pressing in behind them. Once they stepped into the cool night air, Charles could almost feel the hostile stares burning into his back. He knew exactly who was watching. Agents of the Navy and the world government, their cold, predatory auras flickering just out of sight. In this city, right under the nose of Naval Command, only the most skilled operatives could remain so thoroughly hidden. Miles away, in the heart of the naval headquarters, the Admiral's office was suddenly shattered by a sharp chime. Cyborg Sora's mechanical eye blinked as the planted bug in his desk phone buzzed insistently. Installed by the mysterious old star, Wu Laoxing, it had been silent until now. Without hesitation, Sora snapped to attention and lifted the receiver. "Moses, do you copy?" The crackling response was immediate. "This is Steelbone Kong at Navy headquarters. Go ahead." Kong's voice was steel and thunder, and as Sora straightened in his chair, both men braced themselves for the orders that were surely coming. "Captain Steelbone, set sail for the Chambered Islands at once, and apprehend the pirate Charles." Admiral Rana's voice crackled through the Den Mushi, leaving no room for objections. Captain Kong froze. Den Mushi pressed to his ear. Beside him, Lieutenant Sora opened his mouth to ask what was happening, only for the Admiral to cut the line with a click. The busy tone buzzed in the silence that followed. Kong's fist slammed onto the polished table, rattling cups and papers. "What's he up to now?" he growled. "Prepare a warship immediately. I want every detail on Charles's movements in the Chambord Islands." "Right away, sir." The two Marines on duty snapped to attention. One bolted for the intelligence office. The other raced down to the docks to signal the crew. Within moments, sirens wailed through the halls of Marine headquarters in Marin Vanduo, officers darting to their stations. Before dawn, the flagship slipped its moorings and carved through the dark waters. Captain Kong stood at the bow, arms folded, his coattails snapping in the brisk wind. Lieutenant Sora scanned the horizon through his spyglass. "There," Sora whispered, pointing. A single flare bloomed from the shoreline, a crimson arc that splashed the sky with blood-red light. Charles was there, and with that signal flare, he'd just sent the Marines a warning. The real hunt was about to begin. Charles watched anxiously as the crew members hurried back with their orders. Their captain's voice cut through the air. "Take her back to the ship. Things are about to get dangerous here. You shouldn't stay." He turned to Elena, whose eyes were wide with worry. "What about you?" she blurted out. Charles forced a reassuring smile. He studied her beautiful, anxious face for a moment before answering. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Once I've dealt with whatever's waiting for me here, I'll come back and take you home, back to your ship." Even after 2 months together, the thought that he'd finally earned a place in her heart filled him with pride. He gave her a playful nudge on the shoulder. "Now hurry. Get to the boat. Paul and Isaac will see you safely aboard. And if I do end up in trouble, well, go have fun without me, okay?" Elena bit her lip as she watched him stride off toward the port of Island 8. Her voice trembled as she shouted, "Promise me you'll come back!" Charles halted for just a heartbeat, then turned, Flasnay, head her a quick wave, and vanished into the throng, leaving Elena clutching herself on the dock. Elena's anxiety welled up, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. The little girl beside her gripped her hand even more tightly. Chapter 102, Demon Sword. Beatty and Charles stood alone on the docks of Island Num, the salt-heavy wind tugging at his coat as he peered across the restless sea. Even from shore, he could taste the acrid tang of gunpowder on the breeze. He didn't have to wait long. Through the morning mist, 10 imposing warships of the Navy headquarters appeared on the horizon. Charles allowed himself a wry smile. Leading the formation was Admiral Ironbone Sora. Perched on the prow, Sora cut a formidable figure. His tawny skin gleamed under the rising sun, and his black and white hair and beard were styled in the bold strokes of the character for Mountain. A sleeveless black tunic bore the Navy's badge, showcasing arms corded with muscle. Dark green armbands hugged his biceps, and a pale yellow scarf looped around his neck. Over his broad shoulders flew a half-white, half-gray greatcoat, his so-called justice cloak, fluttering like a battle standard. A jagged scar, neatly stitched beneath his left eye, testified to countless past duels. "Fire!" Admiral Ironbone Sora's command boomed across the water. In perfect unison, the 10 warships unleashed their broadsides. The thunderous volleys tore toward Charles, who simply narrowed his eyes. At his side hung the 7-star sword, its 7 shimmering sigils pulsing faintly in the dawn light. the only answer he needed to meet the Navy's assault. Charles felt his aura burst forth, burning with the tyrannical majesty of an overlord ascending to the heavens. He raised the seven-star sword in a deliberate arc and uttered, "Demon sword, Batian." In an instant, a domineering power enveloped the blade, amplifying its strength far beyond the ordinary. As Charles brought the sword down, the sword's oppressive force entwined with his own will, creating a titanic shockwave that swallowed the sky and darkened the sun. That wave thundered straight toward the 10 warships arrayed under Kong's command. Charles had barely taken in the size and armament of Kong's fleet, nearly a full complement of the demon-slaying order's vessels, before he realized there was no time for hesitation. All 10 ships had to be destroyed before they could unleash their combined firepower. From his station at the bow, Kong's eyes went wide at Charles's sudden, overwhelming assault. "Damn it!" Kong roared. His aura flared like a storm born of darkness and lightning, coiling around his clenched fists. With a fierce cry, "Slash!" he leapt into the air, body crackling with black energy, and drove a devastating punch into the heart of Charles's shockwave. But even Kong's lightning-fast reaction came a heartbeat too late. The undulating force of Batian shattered upon impact and then surged onward, unstoppable. Excluding his own ship, Charles had obliterated 5 of the 9 enemy vessels in a single strike, but he scowled in disappointment. Only 5? Hardly the thrilling victory he'd hoped for. Across the chaotic waters, Kong's eyes burned red and steam curled from his ears. Charles's last blow had slaughtered over 200 of his finest naval troops, headquarters elite. Furious beyond measure, Kong bellowed, "Charles, you'll pay for this." With a disdainful snort, Kong sprang from the deck and skated across the sea's surface in a single, graceful arc. "Humph." Charles let the corner of his mouth twitch into a mocking smile. He gripped the 7-star sword with both hands, summoning a shimmering green aura that swirled around him. "Then let's see who dies first," he called. In the blink of an eye, Charles vanished, only to reappear directly before Sora. With a crashing clang, punch and blade collided. The force of their duel sent shockwaves rippling through the air and churned the sea into frothing waves that radiated outward. Another thunderous impact hurled them both off their feet, spinning head over heels through the spray. Charles flipped through the air, landing in a crouch as Steelbone Kong eased his pace. The hulking pirate hovered 100 meters away, then planted his foot on an invisible current and surged forward. "Charles," Kong snarled, voice like grinding steel, "I can't let you get away. This sea doesn't need another pirate like rocks." In the next instant, Kong's obsidian fists closed in, crackling with crimson overlord energy edged in black armor light. Charles met him head-on, drawing the 7-star sword in one smooth motion. The blade pulsed with a mesmerizing red and green aura. From the rooftop of a nearby watchtower, Kong's Lieutenant Sora stared in disbelief. "Is that the demon sword? The 7-star sword?" she whispered. Charles held the sword aloft, lips curling in a confident grin. "Exactly. Demon sword, 7-star sword. Prepare yourself." Their powers collided in a blinding flash, scarlet sparks tangled with emerald ripples, each refusing to yield. Shockwaves ripped through the air, rattling the rooftops across the island. On another vantage point, a veteran pirate muttered, "Could this be the legendary duel of the ocean's strongest?" As crimson lightning and emerald currents battled overhead, both warriors steadied themselves for the fight of their lives, each determined to prove supremacy on these wild, uncharted waves. Morgan Cole, a young photographer clutching his camera, stopped dead in his tracks when he witnessed the spectacle before him. Without a second thought, he raised the camera to his eye. "Heads up, this is massive. I've got to call the boss right now." He laughed, fingers already poised over the shutter. Click, click. His grin vanished when he realized the viewfinder was pitch black. "Damn it, I forgot to power it on," he swore, flipping the switch and resetting the shot. Moments later, his communicator chirped to life. "Boss, you won't believe this. Admiral Steelbone Sora is locked in combat with Captain Charles of the Rock's Pirates 8th Division, out here in the Chambord Islands. I'm sending the photos over now." He let out a roar of laughter. "Spread the word across every port. This is front-page news. The Iron Admiral versus the Blood Swordsman on the Chambord deck. Who'll come out on top?" Morgan tapped the final image onto the press wire, and grinned as the confirmation blinked on his screen. "All set, boss." At that signal, the newsroom erupted. From the rooftop launchers, a flock of carrier gulls descended on the wind, each bird carrying Morgan's scoop in its beak. Within minutes, newspapers bearing the headline "Steelbone Sora versus Captain Charles, Battle at Chambord" soared off to every corner of Island Num X and beyond. The battlefield lay in ruin. Craters gouged the earth like wounds, collapsed walls and shattered roofs testified to lives lost. An unseen tally of the weak crushed under the force of this confrontation. Dust still swirled, a reminder that power left nothing unscathed. Opposite Charles stood two towering adversaries: Sora, the cyborg Kong, his metal plating dented and scorched, and Steel Bone Kong, his armored flesh riddled with fresh sword cuts. Both bore the marks of the relentless fight that had already reduced this place to rubble. Charles wiped blood from his cheek and let out a harsh laugh. "Is that all you've got, Sora? Your punches are nothing but wind. Pathetic," he taunted, voice steel sharp with defiance. Sora's glowing eyes narrowed. He clenched a fist the size of Charles's torso. "You'll eat those words," he snarled. "I'll bury you deeper than this wasteland. You'll never see daylight again." Before Charles could reply, Steelbone Kong roared and swung an arm ablaze with crimson energy. "Demon Fire Slash!" A torrent of searing flames surged toward Charles. He reacted instantly, summoning the seven-star sword's aura. The blade flared to life, a shimmering arc of light that met the fiery assault head-on with a thunderous crash. Stone cracked under the force, and the air lit up with dancing sparks. Even as Kong's gauntlet slammed into his sword aura, Charles's counterslash carved a streak of blood across the metal fist. Triumph ignited in Charles's chest. "That's better. Show me everything you've got," he shouted. He moved like lightning. Each swing of his seven-star sword trailed silver after images, the blade singing as it cleaved through the swirling dust and debris. No longer did he fear overstraining the weapon. Its ancient resilience matched his own rising fury. Unleashing his power without restraint, Charles wove a storm of sword chi. Tens of thousands of razor-sharp currents sprang from his blade, ripping through the air in blinding torrents of force. The two Kongs braced for the onslaught, but Charles was relentless. His every strike drove forward, each one heavier and faster than the last, until the battlefield itself trembled under the might of his seven-star wrath. "Surround Sora at once," the commander barked. "Seal off every exit. If he can't run, we'll force him into a head-on breakthrough." A jet-black aura of weaponized energy coalesced around Sora, suffusing him with a domineering power that made Charles gape in astonishment. He had never seen such a potent manifestation of arms mastery before. This man was a veritable weapons monster. Rumor had it that Karp had tried to replicate his technique, but witnessing it in person only deepened Charles's anxiety. Chapter 103. Charles felt a cold fury settle in his chest. Of the three colors he wielded, domination, knowledge, and arms, only the armed color remained his stumbling block. He had mastered the first two. Now he had to conquer this last weakness, no matter the cost. With that resolve, he unleashed his knowledge color in a sweeping wave that enveloped the entire Chambord Islands. Every nook and crag, every canyon and inlet, was bathed in luminous runes of insight. From hidden coves to bustling harbors, his allies, hundreds of loyal technicians and soldiers, sprang into action. "Move it," Paul barked, racing along the line of men and women fitted with strange transparent tablets. "Today's the deadline. Finish the coding, and each of you gets 100 million Baileys." Under Charles's orders, these crews had been assembled to apply a protective film over the island's key installations. With the Admiral's fleet closing in, there would be no second chance. The longer they delayed, the greater Charles's vulnerability, and Paul knew they couldn't hold out forever. To Paul's mind, the Navy's Admiral was nothing short of unstoppable. He pictured the grand threefold hulls of the warships, bristling with cannons, and he half expected the sea itself to part before them. As he sprinted past, the sky above seemed to split with thunderous explosions. Blades of energy crackled through the air, and every wave that crashed on the shore sounded like a herald of war. But Charles's barrier of knowledge pressed on, illuminating every hidden flaw in the enemy's approach. Paul glanced back once more, took a deep breath, and shouted for his crew to keep coding, no matter what. If they succeeded today, the islands and everyone on them might still survive the coming storm. At the prow of the boat, Elena planted her feet where Charles often stood. She clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened and bowed her head in prayer. Never in her life had she found herself begging like this for the very man who had overthrown her poise, inflamed her temper, and yet haunted her with worry. With one hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly, she felt the flutter of the 2-month-old life growing inside her. She refused to see her child born without a father. In the weeks since she'd conceived, dark thoughts had sometimes tempted her, but the tiny heartbeat within her always brought her back from the edge. She could not, and would not, drag her unborn child into death. Taking a steadying breath, Elena lifted her chin and looked out across the water toward the raging battle. "Sweetheart," she whispered, voice firm but tender, "let's pray for your daddy together. Your father is strong. He will come through this." Then, with all the force of her conviction, she called out across the wind and waves, "Charles, lay down your sword and surrender!" On the shoreline, Kong froze in disbelief. He stared at Charles's blood-soaked armor, his own hands trembling where they clutched his weapons. A few paces away, Xiaoluo sank to one knee, driving the 7-star sword's tip into the earth. He tilted his head back, eyes half closed, as though he saw someone, Sora, beyond the sky itself. His voice came at last, harsh and disbelieving. "You'd surrender? Unarmed?" "Chapter Kex, this isn't my style." Charles pushed himself upright, swaying slightly on unsteady legs. All around him lay the aftermath of a fierce duel. Half of Island Number had been cleaved in two. The colossal tree that once crowned its center was nothing more than shattered splinters strewn across the blasted landscape. Not a single building stood intact. The island now lay bare under a bruised sky. Across the ruin-strewn clearing, Kong stared at Charles with a mixture of wariness and fascination. A strange emerald aura quivered around the young pirate, as if the very air had turned alive with that uncanny green light. It prickled at Kong's senses, whispering doubts and unsettled thoughts, but he willed himself to focus, pushing aside the disquiet. Charles's silhouette was rigid and proud, every line of his slender frame exuding defiance. He looked no more than a boy, yet carried himself like a pillar of iron. Despite the turmoil the lad had unleashed, Kong felt a pang of something like sympathy. He knew exactly how Charles had fallen into piracy, and why his superiors, Wu Loxing and the Tianlong Admiralty, had tasked him with coming to the Chambered Islands. The reason, bizarre as it sounded, was simple. Charles had single-handedly destroyed the Tianlong auction house. Now a full military detachment was en route to apprehend him. For onlookers, sending generals after one young pirate might seem absurd. But Kong understood the true danger Charles posed, and he was determined to see how far this strange green power would carry the boy before it consumed him. High above the battlefield, Charles, one of Tianlong's generals, reminded himself of his duty, to safeguard his people, even their possessions. He gripped his sword hilt and floated, ready for whatever came next. A faint, pitying glint flashed in Kong's empty eyes as he regarded Charles. Then Kong's fist pulsed with power, an oppressive aura swirling around it. "Steelbone Nanda," he roared. In a single stride, Kong closed the distance. Charles braced himself, but the attack came faster than he could fully prepare for. More than a dozen shadowy afterimages of Kong's fists smashed into Charles's chest in rapid succession. Bang, 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 bang. Each impact rattled Charles's defenses. Kong's eyes flared with domineering fervor as he launched the final crushing blow. Crimson lightning crackled around his fist as he drove it toward Charles's heart. Charles recoiled on pure instinct. In his mind's eye, he saw the fist smashing through bone and flesh, felt the promise of death in that single terrifying moment. "No," he gasped. He gritted his teeth, veins bulging at his throat. There was no choice. He had to stop it. Summoning every ounce of his will, Charles unleashed his own fierce aura. Determination blazed behind his eyes. If he fell now, Tianlong would lose its shield, and Charles would not allow that to happen. Charles's 7-star sword shimmered with intertwining streams of imperial crimson and emerald lightning. Caught off guard, he had no time to launch an attack, so he brought the sword up, bracing it across his chest. With a deafening clang, Sora's fist smashed into the sword in midair. They never made direct contact. Instead, a blinding surge of energy crackled between them. The opposing forces fed off one another, their power swelling until, bang, both fighter and blade were thrust apart, sent hurtling through the sky. Sora, blinking to clear his vision, steadied himself just in time to see Charles spinning end over end. Despite fresh cuts and bruises marring his face, Charles was grinning, the wind tearing at his hair as he laughed in defiance. Sora's heart skipped. Why was his opponent still smiling? A thunderous shout cut through the roar of the wind. "Charles!" Sora looked up and spotted an airship hovering above the field, its silhouette familiar. Instantaneously, he knew it was Charles's own vessel, come to his rescue. Charles disappeared beneath the waves in an instant. The enemy had coated their boarding ship with that grappling film, yanked him out of the air, and then their vessel plunged below the surface before anyone could stop them. Kong's heart pounded with rage and frustration. It had been his single lapse, a moment's hesitation, that handed Charles the chance to slip away. Sora stood by, fists clenched, equally furious but powerless to do anything. Together, they watched the last ripple fade where Charles had been hauled aboard that sinking ship. If Kong hadn't been nursing that sword wound, he would have dove straight into the water after him. Now the slash across his side throbbed every time he breathed. He shook his head. There was simply no time left to chase a phantom beneath the waves. "Regroup," he barked. He forced himself to swallow his anger and strode back to the battered fleet. Once, they had 10 warships. Now only 5 remained afloat, and each of those was scarred by fire and torn sails. The other half lay shattered on the shoals, or had gone to the bottom with their crews. The rush of rescued sailors and injured men filled the air with cries and groans. Kong's fingers curled until his nails bit into his palms. He threw a punch into the open air, sending a gust of wind crackling into the empty sky. It was a shout more than a blow, an eruption of all the fury he couldn't unleash on Charles. "Form up," he roared to the nearest destroyer. "Get the wounded below decks. Ready the hatches and rig for repair. We sail at first light." As his officers scrambling to obey, Kong inhaled deeply and forced his shoulders down. There would be time later to nurse his anger and his wound. For now, the fleet needed its captain. And somewhere in the depths, Charles was still out there, eluding them. The hunt was far from over. "Send a medical ship from Navy headquarters to tend to the wounded," Admiral Steelbone Kong barked, his fury rippling through the command deck. His officers exchanged tense nods and sprang into action, issuing orders without hesitation. Far away in the presidential office, President Morgans leaned forward over a desk strewn with photographs and video tablets. These images had just arrived from frontline reporters who'd captured every moment of the clash. At the sight of Kong facing off against blood swordsman Rockefeller Charles, Morgans's eyes narrowed. He tapped a red button on his console. "Deploy Skyhawk," he commanded. Within minutes, the military's most advanced reconnaissance aircraft, nicknamed the Skyhawk, roared into the sky. On board, a squad of war correspondents worked feverishly, cameras and video rigs ready. From high altitude, they filmed the epic duel below. Kong's mechanized fists smashing against Charles's flaming red sword, sparks flying on each devastating blow. Back on the deck, Kong gritted his teeth as he parried a strike. Despite the pain of his damaged armor, he refused to yield. Across the battlefield, Charles spun his blade in a glowing arc, every movement precise and deadly. Their battle was now being transmitted live to the highest levels of command, and to an eager public watching from every corner of the globe. Chapter 104, Old Star's Wrath. The morning's first casualty, the reporter who'd stumbled onto the scene, succumbed to his injuries in the wake of Charles's showdown with Admiral Cyborg Kong. Though Charles fought fiercely, he lost decisively, and nearly paid with his life. Only Kong's intervention allowed him to escape. By tomorrow morning, this would be headline news across the fleet. Charles rode back at Kong's side. Beneath a blood-red sunset, Island Number 7 lay in ruins. The hum of life that once made the island thrive had been silenced. From piles of shattered buildings, survivors crawled out into the fading light, staggering over debris as they took in the devastation. Charles stood frozen, unable to believe this wasteland had been the booming heart of Island Number 7. All around him, people wept quietly over fallen homes and lost loved ones. Once again, war had reminded them. In conflict, the civilians always suffer most. They returned to Kong's command office in near-silent procession. Kong crossed the room and stood before a small communications bug embedded in the wall, a direct link to their hidden base. He steadied his hand, hesitated for a long moment, then tapped the panel to activate it. "Kong here. Report in. Now." A crackling voice answered immediately. "Admiral, is that you? This is Wu Laoxing. What's the situation? Did you secure Charles?" Kong swallowed. His expression darkened. "We failed." A stunned pause crackled over the line. Then Wu Laoxing's voice broke through again, urgent and disbelieving. "Failed? How? They had the asset right there. What went wrong?" Kong closed his eyes. The rubble of Island Number 7 weighed on him like a cruel omen. "We miscalculated. I'll send you the full report when I regroup." He cut the feed and stepped back, shoulders slumped. Behind him, the shattered island lay silent under the dying light, a grim testament to power unleashed and to the fury of Old Star's wrath. Sora ground his teeth to hold back his anger. What kind of nonsense is this? You're supposed to be the captain of the 8th Division of the Lock's pirates, an admiral no less, and you let him slip through your fingers? On the other end of the comlink, one of the Wu Laoxing, brandishing a knife, snarled in frustration. Hearing the sharp rebuke, Kong clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles cracked. "Fine. Sora, explain yourself. Charles didn't look that formidable, did he?" A bearded veteran among the Wu Laoxing stepped between Kong and the knife-wielder. "Settle down," he ordered. As soon as an elder spoke up, Kong relaxed enough to breathe. "I sparred with Charles for a full day," he reported. "He really is strong, his technique's flawless. The problem is he's too young, still raw. But give him time to grow, and I wouldn't be surprised if he became as powerful as rocks." Sora's voice over the comm was tense. The 5 senior Wu Laoxing exchanged worried glances. The knife-wielder barked. "Spare us the excuses. You failed, and that's on you." "How old is Charles? He's only 21, still in the prime of life. Are you just attacking him to cover up your own failures?" Wu Laoxing's tone was merciless. Kong clenched his fists, but held his tongue. "Enough," Kong said through gritted teeth. "We're not here to argue his age. Our task is to figure out how to handle Charles. Intelligence reports show he isn't like the other pirates. He follows his own code of honor, and he has a habit of freeing slaves. Since 1479 of the Haiyuan calendar, ever since he first crossed paths with a slaving fleet, he's traveled with 5 young women who claim to be his maids, though they seem more than mere servants. Almost every day, he comes across a slaver ship and liberates its cargo. At this rate, the New World slave trade will be crippled. We need a plan to rein him in. Otherwise, the Tianlong faction will start creating even bigger headaches for us." Listening through a concealed bug, Sora's jaw dropped. They spoke of human lives as casually as cattle. His chest tightened with disgust. Before he could make sense of it all, Wu Laoxing added, "And don't forget, Hive Island reports that Charles has quite the reputation for indulgence." Sora drew in a shaky breath. Their words clashed violently with everything he believed about justice. He realized that if Charles's opponents could brand his compassion as a weakness, they'd stop at nothing to destroy him, and he wouldn't stand by and let that happen. The 5 elders sat in solemn silence beneath the flickering lantern light. At last, the eldest among them, a lean man with a calculating smile, spoke. "The slaves she rescued," he began, "are all young and handsome. She keeps them by her side like treasured pets. It's obvious she's drawn to good looks. Her desire is her weakness. We can exploit this far more easily than with Xia Luo's current resources." A second elder, marked by a faint birthmark on his forehead, leaned forward. "We only need the right opportunity." "How about dispatching a CP0 operative?" suggested the third elder, his blonde hair gleaming. "They could create exactly the opening we want." "Agreed," chorused the other 2 elders without hesitation. With that, their plan to infiltrate and undermine her was decided. The eldest elder tipped his wide-brimmed hat and lifted a den mushi to his ear. "And regarding Charles," he said into the shell, "we can drop surveillance on him for the moment. Instead, our top priority must be shoring up the Navy. Right now, its forces are nowhere near strong enough to contain the pirates." "Understood," came the reply from Sora through the den mushi's receiver. Recruitment drives are already underway in all 4 seas, but it'll be some time before we see results." As Sora spoke, he couldn't help but frown inwardly. Not long ago, he'd gone to great lengths to stifle the Navy's growth, afraid of granting it too much power. Now the very organization he helped keep small was being rebuilt, piece by piece. If it hadn't been for the sudden resurgence of the Rocks pirates, who, in a single daring stroke, swallowed the latter half of the Grand Line and drove our Navy back to the shores of the Red Earth continent, the Marines could have continued their westward expansion unimpeded. In truth, the Navy's gains owed more to the chaos the Rocks unleashed than to any of our own flagships. Yet to Admiral Wulaxing, that aid felt like eating a fly. No sooner had Wulaxing received the report than he snapped off his call with Commander Kong. He longed to punish Kong for the blunder, but Marine headquarters was desperately short of experienced admirals. The new generation of high-performance warships still awaited captains, and there simply weren't enough senior officers to fill the ranks. "Mary Jo, get me the morning papers," Wulaxing barked from behind his desk. "Damn Morgans!" He slammed his saber onto the wood the moment an orderly handed him the broadsheet. Every aide in the antechamber froze as he unfolded the front page. The headline blazed back at him: "Admiral surrounds Rock's pirate Captain Rockefeller Charles at Chambord Islands." Admiral Wulaxing's face went stone cold. Rockefeller Charles, the 20-something pirate captain who'd risen so fast that even the world government found him alarming, had encircled one of our senior admirals in the labyrinth of Chambord Shoals. The very force we'd relied on to weaken our enemies was now laying siege to us. He leaned forward, fingers splayed across the paper. "Launch a second fleet immediately," he ordered the staff officer standing to attention. "Inform Admiral Nakio that Chambord is the priority. Rockefeller Charles must not escape, not this time." The officer saluted crisply and hurried out. Alone, Wulaxing allowed himself a thin, dangerous smile. "Charles," he murmured to the empty room, "you've tangled with the wrong admiral. Let's see whose blockade breaks first." With that, he rose, sheathed his saber, and strode from the office, already plotting how to turn the tables on the only pirate captain bold enough to challenge the Marines. Charles burst through the Navy's cordon, slipping past Admir, all steel bone Kong's encirclement, a disastrous misstep by the admiral. If they couldn't even detain one low-ranking officer, how did they expect to capture Rox Jebek, captain of the notorious Rox pirates? Once again, the Navy's incompetence had been laid bare. Below decks on the flagship, Officer Wulaxing gripped his knife, jaw clenched as he scanned the morning dispatch. Veins stood out on his forehead. At the same moment, Admiral Steel Bone Kong, nicknamed Cyborg Kong, slammed the same newspaper onto his desk, his face flushed crimson. "Damn those Morgans," he thundered. Wulaxing snarled in agreement. "Deploy CP0 immediately. We'll have Morgans under arrest within the hour." The 5-star intelligence chief, brim of his peaked cap casting a shadow over his eyes, stiffened at the order. The newspaper had been delivered by Morgan's couriers overnight, and its contents struck him as a personal affront. "You're wasting your time," he snapped. Morgans foresaw this reaction. He slipped away at dawn. The Admiral's blonde-haired officer fixed a hard stare on the cap-wearing intelligence chief. "Then what do we do?" he demanded. "Find out where he went." Captain Marie Joya's voice cut through the dim corridor as she tapped the 5-star emblem on her cap. Her CP0 squad snapped to attention, each agent fanning out to scour the ruined complex for any trace of the elusive Morgans. Among them was Charles, the youngest recruit, his pulse racing as he kicked aside a broken barrel and swept a cracked window pane. His comm crackled to life almost immediately. "Captain," Charles panted into his mic, "we've located Morgan's lair, but it's empty. He must have slipped out already." Gioia didn't hesitate. She strode into the cavernous hideout, her polished boots echoing against the concrete floor. Everywhere she looked, torn documents and debris lay scattered in the stale air. Charles hurried to her side. She paused over a half-buried sheet of paper. Its edges were singed, and crimson ink streaked one corner. Charles knelt to brush away a shard of glass. "It looks like a map," he said softly. Gioia unfolded the brittle page, her eyes narrowing as she read the bold message scrawled across the top. "You're too late." Chapter 105, Preparations for War. I'll give you a gift. The words blazed across the parchment in enormous characters. The CP0 captain's blood ran cold as a premonition of disaster washed over him. Not good. Brace yourselves, he shouted. At his command, a shockwave radiated outward from beneath their feet. There was no time to react before the ground erupted. A towering explosion sent flames skyward, twisting into a mushroom cloud at the island's center. The tremor rattled every bone in their bodies. Above the chaos, Morgans hovered, wings spread wide. He let out a mocking laugh. You really thought you could catch me? You're centuries too late. With a powerful beat of his wings, he shot toward the horizon, away from the blasted island and toward the new world, where he would establish a new base. Below him, the embers and smoke from the explosion drifted upward. Every CP0 operative who had set foot on the island had been caught in the blast. None survived. A lone voice crackled over the emergency comm. It's total annihilation. The message reached the 5 elders of the world government, the so-called old stars in the hat, in an instant. Their calm facades shattered as fury ignited in their eyes. All of his island intelligence operatives had been slaughtered, and Morgans was still at large. He could barely contain his fury. The other 5 masters in the council chamber fell silent, their faces darkening as they watched him pace. At last, the eldest of the 5 old stars, the one with the distinctive birthmark on his forehead, spoke in a measured voice. Enough. Chasing Morgans right now will only tear us apart. Our only option is to set this matter aside until after the Valley of Gods. We cannot afford to disappoint the elders. His words hit the room like a blast of cold wind. Gradually, the tension drained from the others' expressions. The short, blonde-haired old star nodded gravely and added, He's correct. The Valley of Gods opens only once every 40 years. We can't sacrifice that grand opportunity over one fugitive. Silent agreement passed around the table. With a collective shift in mood, they turned their attention to the ritual preparations for the Valley of Gods, as if the crisis on the island had never happened. Meanwhile, far to the north, in the heart of the New World, Overlord Rox leaned back in his obsidian throne and laughed until his sides ached. Ha! Remarkable. He slipped right through Sora's fingers. I must admit, I underestimated him. He set his palms on his knees, the mirth still dancing in his eyes. But this game has only just begun. Lox flipped through the report in his hand, grinning broadly. Ha! This kid Charles has really come into his own. Don't you dare underestimate him. Golden Lion leaned back in his chair, cigar smoke curling around his head. He thumbed through the same dossier and let out a low chuckle. Absolutely. He's the most naturally gifted person I've ever seen. Edward Newgate, Whitebeard himself, took a leisurely sip of wine, then turned to Golden Lion with a mischievous glint in his eye. You know, he drawled, I'd really like to have a child with him. Before anyone could process his words, Charlotte Lingling sprang to her feet. Hold on, why would you want to have a baby with me? A stunned silence fell over the hall. Whitebeard's mustache twitched in surprise. Golden Lion scowled and shook his head. Lox buried his face in his palm, muttering, Doesn't she know how to keep her mouth shut? The memory of their last battle and the near annihilation of Hive Island was still painfully fresh. Lingling, however, didn't seem the least bit embarrassed. Arms crossed and eyebrow arched, she turned to Whitebeard and repeated, Seriously, why me? Let's build a world together. Charles Lingling swept his gaze across the great hall, offering a confident smile. Nearly 100 captains from every corner of the seas had answered Captain Locke's summons, each of them watching him with heated, expectant eyes. At this point, Charles was nothing like the broad-shouldered, barrel-chested figure he'd become in later years. Now he was lithe and almost delicate, his graceful form drawing more than a few lecherous stares, and even prompting some bold captains to lean forward, as if daring themselves to plant a kiss on his soft lips. Behind him, Kaido, a bulky, sweaty enforcer with 2 enormous horns curling from his brow, watched the crowd with barely suppressed amusement. Though an intern in the feared Rox pirates, Kaido had pledged himself to Charles's service, handling every chore the young captain assigned him. Charles insisted on calling him my little brother, and Kaido, whether out of loyalty or sheer stubbornness, never objected. A sudden roar shattered the murmurs. Golden Lion, the captain famed for both his golden mane and his ferocious temper, slammed a fist against the table so forcefully that the candles flickered. "That's enough," he boomed. "We didn't come here to help some pretty boy shop for a husband. What pressing matter has Captain Locke gathered us for? Is this about Charles's latest intelligence report? And where are the Heighton twins and Muchen? They should have been here by now." Charles inclined his head with polite composure. "Brothers, sisters, I assure you, there's no matchmaking on my mind," he said. "But the tides are shifting, and Captain Locke has urgent news about our next venture, one that could change the fate of every crew in this hall. Let us begin." After Golden Lion Shiji finished speaking, a ripple of relief swept through the crowd. In the past, Captain Rox had summoned only the commanders of the main squadrons to his war council, but today he'd extended the invitation even to the junior captains, an unheard-of gesture that had everyone silently buzzing. Rodney Carter, who served under Charles, was among them. Charles himself was conspicuously absent, and his chair stood empty near the front. No one dared claim it. Carter contented himself with a seat directly behind it, standing in for his missing superior. Such was the reputation of Charles. His strength alone was enough to ward off any would-be usurper. All eyes then drifted to the vacant captain's chair of the 7th Squad, formerly held by Hayton Muchan. Although no one sat there now, no one questioned Hayton's right to the title. Under Rox's rule, power spoke louder than pedigree, and every ambitious officer knew better than to challenge the captain of the 7th. Time and again, any rival bids had been quashed by Captain Rox himself, ensuring Hayton's seat remained unassailable. Captain Rox rose, his gaze sweeping the assembly. The murmurs died away as he spread his arms wide and roared, "Ho, ho, ho! I've called you all here for one reason. Tomorrow, we launch a grand war, a war that will shake the very foundations of this world." At his proclamation, the assembly fell deathly silent. Then, one by one, boots thudded on the deck as captains straightened in their seats, faces alight with fierce anticipation. The era of rum and cannon fire was upon them, and the Rox pirates stood ready to seize destiny itself. Locke climbed onto the raised platform, his gaze sweeping over every pirate assembled in the hall. "Listen up," he began, his voice carrying clearly over the murmuring crowd. "For months now, we've remained on Hive Island, biding our time until I give the order to launch a war that will change the balance of power in this world. And with the 7th team's captain gone, I'm issuing a challenge. Whoever distinguishes themselves most in this coming conflict will take his place as the new captain of the 7th team." A subtle current of energy rippled from Locke, and the pirates fell silent at the weight of his words. Then, as if released all at once, their excitement exploded into deafening cheers. "Long live Captain Locke! Long live Captain Locke!" Locke allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at their acclamations. However, the cadre of senior officers standing nearest him exchanged uneasy looks. They knew as well as he did that the Rox pirates teetered on the brink of collapse, united only because no one else had dared seize the mantle of leadership. And when a pistol is held to your head, nobody stays foolish for long. Chapter 106. The Golden Lion's plan. Rox swept a critical gaze over his assembled crew, pleased at how sharply the sub-captains had carried out their orders under the division leaders. Yet satisfaction fled the moment he examined the 6 captains themselves. Each man wore a thoughtful frown, and even 2 of his oldest lieutenants, Wang Ji and Silver Axe, seemed uneasy. Their hesitation stung him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Not yet," he cautioned inwardly. "When I claim the power of the Heavenly King and make myself overlord of the world, none of them will dare question me again." Of the 6 captains, 2 weighed most heavily on his mind: Edward Newgate, known far and wide as Whitebeard, and Shiki, the Golden Lion. A dark cloud gathered on Rox's brow as he regarded them. Whitebeard's usually imposing features were creased with worry. In the past few months, he discovered new meaning in life by adopting several orphans, children who now ran to him each morning calling out "Father." With each excited smile and tender embrace, Edward Newgate felt he had finally found his true purpose. The thought of leaving those children pained him more than any battlefield ever could. He would far rather remain at their side than answer Rox's call this day. Shiki, the Golden Lion, meanwhile, bore his own secrets, ambitions that even Rox might not fully fathom. As the wind stirred the banners overhead, all 6 captains seemed lost in private councils of the mind. Rox clenched his fists. Sooner or later, every one of them would have to choose a side, and he intended to make sure they chose his. Charles hesitated on the deck, torn between duty and self-preservation. He'd weighed the cost of refusal, and despite his promise never to let his own sons sail under a pirate's flag, he stepped forward once more. Surrounded by the cacophony of the Rock's pirates, he resolved to lend them his strength, just one last time, before he walked away to chase his true dream. Edward Newgate, known throughout the seas as Whitebeard, stood a short distance off, his massive frame motionless. A low sigh slipped past his famously curved mustache, a subtle admission that the burden of honor and loyalty warred within him. He cast a troubled glance at Charles, conflicted by oaths he could not break and his own rigid code of morality. Golden Lion Shiji watched them both with a glint of cold calculation in his eyes. Ambition and the hunger for independence lay bare on his face, though he made no move to seize the moment. Patiently, he waited for someone else to strike first. It would, he was certain, be Whitebeard who shattered the uneasy truce. When that day came, Shiji would be ready to step forward, join forces with Newgate, and with Charles, who now owed him a great debt, and together the 3 of them would crush Lox without mercy. It was this inevitable outcome that gave Shiji the audacity to taunt the Rock's pirates at every turn, treating the rest of the crew with open disdain. Shiji, the Golden Lion, gave a single dismissive nod. "All right, that's enough. Meeting dismissed." He waved his massive hand, and a hush fell over the room. Only after the 6 senior cadres rose did the others dare to stir. Shiji's amber eyes glittered with contempt. When had the orders of mere administrators ever carried more weight than a captain's command? He clenched his jaw, forcing his irritation down. His restraint, however, only seemed to encourage their insolence. Once the cadres had filed out, the team leaders followed. Captain Charles of the 8th team was nowhere to be seen, so Carter found himself alone at the rear. He trailed awkwardly behind the others, too nervous to muster the courage to walk beside them. Outside the hall, Carter came to a halt. He swallowed hard as he looked up at the towering figure before him. Shiji stood nearly 3 meters tall. "Is there something you wanted, Mr. Golden Lion?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Shiji exhaled a thin plume of smoke, his expression unchanging. "Speak." Shiji, the Golden Lion, fixed Carter well, a steady gaze. "Do you know when your Captain Charles will return?" Carter's heart skipped a beat. He recognized Shiji as one of Charles's most trusted allies. No casual acquaintance would dare address him so directly. Relief washed over Carter when he realized the lion only sought news, not trouble. "Master Shiji," Carter said, bowing his head respectfully, "our captain should be back within the month. You saw for yourself yesterday that he resigned his admiralcy and set sail for Fishman Island. By all accounts, he'll arrive there and be on his way home any day now." Shiji's golden eyes narrowed. 4 or 5 months had slipped by since Charles first entered the Grand Line, and so far he'd accomplished little. What if he couldn't make up for lost time? What if their carefully laid plans unraveled before he even rejoined them? With a low growl, Shiji turned away and began to stride off. "Tell Captain Charles he mustn't forget the favor he owes me," he called back over his shoulder. Then, without waiting for a reply, the great lion vanished into the misty harbor. Once Shiji was gone, Carter exhaled so sharply he feared his ribs might crack. The sooner Charles returned, the better, both for their plans and for Carter's own peace of mind. Carter stood frozen, his heart pounding as if he'd come face to face with a mountain. The Overlord's aura pressed in on him like a vice. When he finally realized everyone else had fled, he spun on his heels and sprinted back to camp. He had to warn his master. What he didn't know was that Charles was already unconscious. Moments earlier, Charles had summoned every last ounce of strength to push back with that same crushing energy. The force drove him stumbling onto the deck of his ship, where he managed to shout the order to dive. No sooner had he ensured the submerging mechanisms were engaged than his legs buckled, and he collapsed, blacking out on the wooden planks. Alarm spread through the tiny crew of just over 20, navigators, cooks, boatmen, and 2 ship doctors. Elena, the captain's first mate, dropped everything and rushed to his side. "Charles," she cried, gathering him into her arms. The ship's 2 doctors hurried forward, gently lifting him to check his pulse and look for injuries. Under the dim lantern glow, their anxious faces exchanged grim looks. Charles was out cold, and none of them knew when he might wake. Dr. Koslov rolled Charles's eyelids open one last time, then pressed his stethoscope firmly against Charles's chest. Across the narrow infirmary, Dr. Mendez exchanged a troubled glance with his colleague, and together they shook their heads. Irina, sitting on the edge of the examination table, gasped. Isaac stumbled backward. Elena crumpled to her knees, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Paul's heart thudded in his ears. "What's wrong with Charles?" he demanded, voice breaking. In a flash of desperation, Paul lunged forward and yanked both doctors by their collars, hoisting them off the deck. Their boots slipped on the metal floor as they dangled, legs kicking. "Tell me now!" Paul thundered. Dr. Mendez's face went pale. With a strangled cough, he managed, "Sir, please put us down. Charles is all right. He's just exhausted and has a few superficial cuts. Nothing life-threatening. He needs rest, that's all." Paul released them. They crumpled to the deck, gasping for air. He stood over them, eyes narrowed. "If he's really fine," he said quietly, "then why did you both shake your heads?" The 2 doctors met each other's gaze, guilt and uncertainty flickering in their eyes, yet neither of them spoke. "We still haven't checked on the boss." The ship's doctor met Paul's fierce glare, his voice trembling. Chapter 107, Comatose. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Paul's hand shot out, shoving the ship's physician to the deck. Heart pounding, he turned to Elena. "Sister-in-law, he's alive. The boss isn't gravely hurt. He's simply collapsed from exhaustion. He needs a few days of rest." Irina, standing nearby with tears in her eyes, let out a trembling sigh of relief. "That's a blessing. Please, let him wake up as soon as he can." 19-year-old Yeliana, cheeks still wet from tears, looked around in confusion. She'd never faced such a crisis before and didn't know where to stand. Elena's voice cut through the tense silence. "Move quickly. Carry him into the captain's cabin." "Right away," Paul barked. He strode to Charles's side. The young man lay motionless on the cold deck, pale and unresponsive. Watching the coarse sailors clumsily hoist him up, Paul couldn't hide his disgust. "Take care! Handle him gently!" The men stumbled as they lifted Charles, their rough manners only confirming what Paul already suspected. These deckhands lacked the skill and discretion his boss required. Elena fell into step beside Irina, gently guiding Yeliana behind her, and together they hurried after the others toward the captain's cabin. Paul gently lifted Charles onto the narrow bunk. "Sister-in-law, please tend to his wounds. We'll step outside. Just call us if you need anything." With a respectful nod to Elena, he led the others out of the cramped cabin, leaving Elena alone with the little girl, Yeliana. Elena dipped a soft towel into a basin of warm water and pressed it against Charles's face, carefully blotting away the dried blood. When she finally cleared his features, Yeliana covered her mouth in silent shock. The boy's cheeks were marred by brutal scars, and the spirited child she once knew seemed almost gone. Suppressing a sob, Elena peeled away the torn remains of his shirt, revealing bruises and fresh scrapes. She worked methodically, rinsing each wound with gentle strokes of the towel. Beside her, Yeliana wordlessly refilled the basin again and again, offering clean water without a single complaint. After several minutes, Charles lay noticeably cleaner. His breathing was steady, but his pale face remained drawn and exhausted. Overcome with sorrow, Elena reached out and cradled his arm. Then, unable to hold back her grief any longer, she let out a long, heart-wrenching wail that echoed through the corridors of the ship. Paul and Isaac stood just outside Charles's cabin, their heads bowed in frustration. Normally, when they were tense, they'd step out for a smoke, but since learning of Irina's pregnancy, Charles had forbidden anyone on the ship from lighting up. The crew grumbled in private, but no one dared defy the captain's orders, and especially with Elena never far from Irina's side. Both men ached for a cigarette to ease their nerves when the navigator approached. "Captain Paul, Captain Isaac," he began, "shall we head to Fishman Island or press on directly into the New World?" With Charles unconscious and Irina in the dark, Paul and Isaac bore sole responsibility for the ship's course, and between them, Paul's word always carried the most weight. He inhaled deeply, steeling himself. Fishman Island is too close to the Sabaudia archipelago, he said. Our last visit did not go smoothly. And with the boss out of action, we'd be inviting retaliation. We'll set sail for the New World instead. Let's set course for the New World. Paul turned to Isaac, who gave a curt nod in agreement. With that, the navigator sprang to the helm. In moments, the ship slipped past the rugged shores of Murloc Island and into the vast, uncharted ocean beyond. Below deck, Charles lay unconscious, yet his body was mending at an astonishing pace. The shallow cuts along his arms and torso had sealed over, and even the deeper wounds were knitting together. The heavy bruising across his nose and cheeks had all but vanished, leaving no more than faint discoloration. For the last 3 days, Elena had maintained a constant vigil by his bedside, her hands never idle, feeding him spoonfuls of broth, changing bandages, and gently wiping his forehead whenever he stirred. Irina, too, had sat by Charles's side, marveling in silence at his rapid recovery. Neither dared speak of how unusual his healing was. They were simply grateful that he grew stronger with each passing hour. From above deck, Paul's voice rang down. Helm, make ready to weigh anchor. We've cleared the Navy's patrol zones. The cautious 3-day detour had been fraught with peril. To evade naval ships, they had skirted the open sea far longer than usual, an especially dangerous gamble, given the legends of colossal Neptunes prowling these waters. Yet now, with the Navy's influence behind them, they pressed onward toward the untamed promise of the New World. Charles's voice cut through the chaos. If we don't gain altitude, the ship will crash, and with the captain still in a coma, we'll be stranded for good. The navigator snapped to attention and barked orders to the crew. They worked around the clock to adjust the rigging and haul the sails higher. For 3 grueling days, Charles kept watch as the ship crept skyward. Then, at last, the clouds parted and the sun broke through, gilding the battered hull with light. The sea stretched out endlessly below them, and for the first time in days, Charles allowed himself to exhale. He crossed the deck and found the navigator studying his charts. How long before we reach the next resupply point? Charles asked, voice low. His stomach clenched, thinking of their dwindling food and water. The navigator unfolded a crinkled sea chart and traced their position with a calloused finger. He tapped the map decisively. We're 1 island away from a port called Jaltsburg. That's where we can restock. Jaltsburg? Charles leaned in. The name was infamous throughout the New World, the so-called Kingdom of Endless Wars. He'd read rumors but never imagined steering this battered vessel toward its shores. A flicker of a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth, equal parts dread and grim anticipation. They had a chance to survive, if they were bold enough to press on. The realm of endless wars stretched before them, 5 or 6 kingdoms locked in constant conflict. Paul peered over the railing and knew this tiny harbor was their only chance to restock before the next battle. Steeling himself, he called out, "All hands, chart a course for Jaltsburg." The crew sprang into motion. Sails were trimmed, ropes secured, and soon the ship's prow pointed toward the distant spires of Jaltsburg. Despite the calm sea and clear skies, Paul's brow stayed creased with worry. Please, let nothing go wrong. And Charles, when will he wake up? It's been 3 days already. Paul sighed in frustration. Isaac, standing at his side, gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Don't be so hard on yourself, he said quietly. Charles should come to within the next day or 2. Then we can all breathe easy. Over the past 72 hours, Paul had filled Charles's role in every way, issuing orders, keeping the crew on schedule, and preventing panic from sprouting among the men. Isaac's confidence helped steady him, and Paul drew a deep breath of relief. I hope you're right, he murmured. I really hope you're right. Chapter 108, Paris. In the ship's infirmary, Elena gently cleans Charles's wounds as she did each morning. Today, however, there was nothing to tend. Every cut and bruise had vanished, replaced by fresh, unblemished flesh as smooth as a newborn's skin. Elena stared in disbelief. Could any ordinary man recover so completely in just 3 days? She pressed a hand to his forehead, then leaned closer, voice barely a whisper. Charles, when are you going to wake up? Beside her, little Panis, whom Elena had rescued 3 days ago, looked up with comforting eyes. Don't worry, sis, the girl said softly. The ship's doctor said the captain's fully healed and could wake at any moment. I'll be extra careful not to jostle you or the baby." Alina managed a small, grateful smile and rested her hand over Panis's. The girl's confidence warmed her heart. At the door stood Lieutenant Liana, watching the two with quiet affection. Over the past few days, she'd seen Elena devote herself to nursing Charles back to health, while Panis tended to Elena's needs. In that short time, Liana had even learned the little girl's name and grown fond of her gentle spirit. Stepping back, Liana whispered, "Let's give them a moment." She knew that at any second now Charles might open his eyes, and the captain would return to them once more. That night, Alina sat by the little boy's bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. For weeks she'd assumed he was mute. He'd never uttered a single word since she rescued him. But as she tucked the blankets around him, he looked up and said in a soft, trembling voice, "It's time to go to sleep, Aunt Elena." Elena froze. The candlelight flickered across his wide eyes. "You can talk," she whispered, astonished. Charles nodded, his small hands clutching the quilt. "Of course I can." Worry kept Elena awake long after the others had gone to bed. As she rearranged the blankets and smoothed the boy's clothes, she started asking questions. "What's your name?" she prompted gently. He met her gaze bravely. "Charles." "And where were you born?" she continued. "Down by the harbor, in a fishing village," he replied, his voice no louder than a breeze. Elena paused. "Do you have anyone left? Family, I mean?" He shook his head. "I've never known my father. My mother, she looked after me until I was 4. Then one night, a nobleman's carriage came. They took her away, and I've never seen her again." Elena's heart clenched. "What happened to your mother?" Charles swallowed. "She died. I don't know how. They wouldn't tell me anything." Tears pricked her eyes as she realized how alone he had been. "And after that?" "I begged in the streets," he said quietly. "Some of the townspeople felt sorry for me. They'd slip me a piece of bread or a bowl of porridge, just enough so I wouldn't starve. It was like that until I was 10. Elena shivered, recalling her own childhood fears. "Then what?" He hesitated, gaze drifting to the window. "Pirates came ashore that year. They robbed nearly every house in the village, hoping to find hidden treasure. I watched them from the shadows." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through so much." Charles nodded, eyes shining with a mixture of sorrow and relief. "I've never had anyone to talk to. I thought no one would understand." Elena pressed his hand in hers. "You're safe now. I'll stay with you, every night if I must. You're not alone anymore." He offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Aunt Elena." That night, for the first time, Charles drifted into sleep without fear, and for the first time, Elena slept soundly, confident that this frightened, brave boy would no longer face the darkness on his own. These pirates meant to traffic slaves. Almost every child in the town had been hauled aboard their ship. After being bought and sold several times, Panis ended up in the Chambord auction house, nothing more than a piece of merchandise. If Charles hadn't intervened, no one could have guessed what horrors her future held. When Irina heard of Panis's fate, he swept into the room, gathered her in her arms, and wept. Then, as if awakening from a dream, she gasped, "Panis, my little sister," and claimed her in front of everyone. That fierce, unexpected love thawed the ice around Panis's heart. It also changed the way she looked at Elena. The two girls, newly reunited, no longer felt like strangers. Panis found herself worrying over Elena in a way she hadn't before. "Sister, you must eat something," Panis urged, holding out a plate piled with freshly grilled meat skewers. Behind her, Ileana had spent every morning and evening coaxing Charles to eat his rice porridge. He managed only a few spoonfuls before losing his appetite. Watching him struggle pained Panis more than she expected. Elena, moved by Panis's gentle concern, offered a small, grateful nod. Then, having sat too long, Elena tried to stand and nearly faltered. Panis was on her feet in an instant, steadying her friend and guiding her carefully to the dining table. That evening, for the first time since the auction's aftermath, the little group felt something like home. Between Charles's shy smiles, Panis's protective energy, Elena's trust, and Irina's sisterly devotion, hope flickered again where despair had nearly reigned. Panis set the dinner plate on the table, and the smoky aroma of grilled meat immediately filled the room. Ileana pressed a hand to her rumbling stomach, the scent too tempting to resist. Then, an unexpected growl. Startled, Iliana looked up. That low rumble wasn't hers, nor Panis's. Only one person lay nearby, Charles. Elena's eyes snapped toward his bed. Another gruff sound came from under the covers, and now Elena was certain it was Charles. "Charles! Charles!" Elena called, abandoning all thought of the steaming meat in front of her. Charles inhaled sharply, his stomach protesting again in a loud grumble. "Meat, meat, meat," he mumbled, words tumbling from his lips even before he fully awakened. Iliana and Panis stared in astonishment. Without hesitating, Elena scooped up the plate and hurried to Charles's bedside. Just as she reached him, Charles bolted upright, swept the dish from her hands, and began devouring the grilled meat with fierce delight. "Meat! I want more meat!" he murmured between mouthfuls, eyes closed in bliss as he gnawed at the last piece. Elena froze for a heartbeat, then her cheeks flamed. Charles was completely naked. Panis, standing next to her, quickly dropped her gaze, unwilling even to glance at him. But Elena recovered herself in an instant. "Quick, send up every skewer of barbecue you've got," she ordered, snapping her fingers at Panis. Panis bolted for the galley and relayed the command. The two cooks exchanged puzzled looks, but wasted no time firing up the grill. A few minutes later, Panis came sprinting back into the captain's cabin, balancing 2 steaming skewers of meat and a pair of wine goblets. "Sister, the barbecue is here," she announced breathlessly. Iliana opened her mouth to speak, but Charles was faster. With a sudden lunge, he snatched both skewers in the plates, then wolfed down 2 palm-sized chunks in one gulp. His stomach bulged for an instant, then settled back to normal as faint wisps of steam rose from the freshly cooked meat clinging to his lips. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, Charles looked eagerly at Panis. "Is there any more barbecue left?" Panis stared at him, completely taken aback by his voracious appetite. Panisi stood before Charles, head bowed so low that she wouldn't meet his eyes. Tears glistened at the corners of her lashes. When Elena saw her like that, she hurried to Charles's side. "Charles, calm down," Elena said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've just woken up. Take a breath and tell us what's happened." At Elena's gentle tone, Charles blinked away his confusion. He straightened and looked at her with dawning relief. "Elena!" Without thinking, he swept her into a grateful embrace. "What's going on? Where am I? Why is everyone so panicked?" Panisi recoiled, startled by the sudden hug. Her cheeks burned as she reached out to pry his arms away. "I'm sorry, sir. Please let go." Charles loosened his grip and stepped back, blinking as his stomach growled audibly. "I'm hungry." He turned to Elena, eyes wide with expectation. "Can we get something to eat?" Elena smiled and slipped his hand into hers. "Of course. Let's go to the kitchen." She called over her shoulder as she led him down the hall. "Chef, prepare a fresh meal at once. He's just woken up and must be starving." As they passed, crew members froze in astonishment. Whispers rippled through the corridor. "He really is awake." "Welcome back, Charles." It felt as though every pair of eyes in the hall was on him. Chapter 109, Jartsburg. Charles nodded anxiously and made a beeline for the galley, tuning out the excited shouts behind him. As word spread that their captain was conscious again, the crew poured onto the deck in a sudden surge of energy. "Captain, he's awake! The boss is awake!" they cried in unison. The ship buzzed to life. Paul and Isaac, who'd been patrolling, sprang toward the captain's cabin, only to find it empty. "Where did he go?" Paul shouted. A sailor passing by pointed toward the galley. "He's in the kitchen!" "Why didn't you say so sooner?" Paul snapped. The man just shrugged and returned to scrubbing the deck. Paul and Isaac sprinted to the galley doors. Paul kicked them open. "Captain, are you all right?" Inside, Charles stood at the counter, a chunk of freshly roasted meat in one hand and a roll in the other. He looked up, chewed deliberately, and rolled his eyes. "I'm fine," he said around a mouthful. "I'm not dead yet. Now please, out of my kitchen. I'm trying to eat." Paul opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He and Isaac exchanged a sheepish glance and backed toward the door. Charles turned back to his meal, unbothered, as the 2 officers quietly slipped away, leaving their captain to his well-earned feast. Charles's words seemed to break the tension in the room. Paul let out a long breath of relief, utterly unconcerned by the sharp rebuke. After all, he'd grown accustomed to Charles's outbursts. "Boss, you had me terrified," Paul said, strolling up with a wry grin. "You were in a coma for 3 days. When you finally woke up, you barely even looked human. My wife cried for hours when she saw you." At the mention of Elena, Charles's eyes flicked to her. Elena shot Paul a fierce glare that clearly said, "Enough already," and Paul scratched his head in apology before falling silent. Charles held Elena's gaze, his hand frozen in midair. Her face was drawn and pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion and faint redness. He knew she'd been crying. Her bravado couldn't fully hide it. "Were you crying because of me?" he asked quietly. Elena's shoulders jerked as she shook her head. "No." Her voice was curt, almost harsh. "Really?" Charles pressed gently, searching her eyes. Elena swallowed, willed herself to look him in the eye, then spat out, "No, who'd waste tears on you, you idiot?" She turned away, ears burning, but her hurried movements betrayed her embarrassment. Charles let it lie. He knew better than to push her further. If she got mad, he'd be the one paying for it. He lowered his hand, offering her a small, understanding smile. For all her tough talk, he could see how much she cared, and sometimes that was all the answer he needed. Charles had been eating nonstop for 2 hours under everyone's astonished eyes, and by the end the chef's spatula was practically smoking from overuse. Finally, with his stomach about 80% full, he set down his fork and rose to his feet, stretching with a series of satisfying cracks that echoed the long weeks of inactivity. "Let's go," he said, beckoning his companions out of the dining cabin. Stepping onto the upper deck, he squinted against the morning sun and surveyed the distant coastline. "We're actually right outside the kingdom of endless wars." While Charles had been feasting, Paul and Isaac had spent the past 3 days filling him in on every development: the skirmishes along the route, Carter's urgent phone call, and the final confirmation that they would soon make landfall in endless wars. Charles had listened intently. At the mention of the kingdom's name, his green eyes narrowed. So the countdown to the Battle of the Valley of the Gods was finally underway. A surge of excitement mingled with apprehension and eager anticipation ran through him. Words felt too small to contain the whirlwind of emotions inside. He barely registered the gentle rumble of the golden lion at his side, his stalwart companion, as it chimed in with its own warnings. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sun's warmth break through any jarring doubts about his previous defeat. Whatever lay ahead in the Kingdom of Endless Wars, Charles felt ready. "It's far too soon for me to face Admiral Cyborg Kong. I'm nowhere near my peak strength or skill, and this battle has laid bare my 2 biggest weaknesses, speed and raw power. In close-quarters combat, I simply couldn't match his tempo. From the first clash, Kong had me under complete control. There was no chance to counterattack. Even with all my experience and overconfidence warning me of his speed, I still couldn't keep up. Despite taking blow after blow, I never lost my composure. Thanks to my accelerated healing and refined sword techniques, I managed to hold out far longer than I ever did against Zephyr. Back then, I could lean on my quick wits and swagger to keep pace, just barely scraping out a stalemate. But this was on a completely different level. Gazing out across the endless sea, I clenched my fist and whispered, "I still have a lot of work ahead of me." Charles couldn't stop thinking about Locke, the pirate who'd driven the Navy out of the New World, and how powerful he must be. But he pushed the thought aside. One day, he'd stand among the greatest in the world, too. Defeat itself wasn't the real failure. The true disaster was never rising again. In the Grand Line, countless fighters had fallen simply because they lost heart, never managing to pick themselves up. Those souls, Charles knew, were doomed to be forgotten. He shook his head. Why dwell on legends? They had nothing to do with him. "How long until we reach our destination?" he asked, leaning against the ship's wheel. "Another hour or 2, tops," the navigator replied, studying the chart closely. Charles peered over the map with growing interest. The island ahead was no larger than a palm, yet somehow it was divided into 5 or 6 tiny kingdoms. He smirked at the irony. No wonder they called it the Island of Endless War. He tapped the chart, raising an eyebrow. "Which harbor are we docking at?" The navigator pointed to a small inlet on the northeastern coast. "Port Fortuna. It's the largest settlement here, and the safest place to come ashore without stepping into someone else's skirmish." Charles nodded, a determined grin spreading across his face. War or peace, he was ready for whatever awaited. Charles leaned over the holomap, tracing the port city's name with his fingertip. Jartsburg, he murmured, the only deep-water harbor on this route. Every merchant ship passes through here. As the ship's navigator, he had memorized countless ports, but this one felt strangely familiar. Then it hit him. Jartsburg was the prison of Douglas Barrett, the man known across the kingdoms as the Devil's Descendant. Even now, Barrett lay under lock and key by order of the Navy's demon-slaying task force. Arrested in a joint operation led by Vice Admiral Garp and the future Fleet Admiral Sengoku. It was whispered that the only person to earn such combined attention was the legendary Golden Lion himself. Charles felt a surge of excitement. Douglas Barrett was barely 7 or 8 years old, yet already notorious enough to draw 2 of the Navy's greatest officers. Taming a child that age would be no small feat. Still, if Barrett could be brought under his wing, imagine the power he'd wield once fully grown, an unstoppable force at Charles's command. He closed his fist in determination. Jartsburg wasn't just another port. It held the key to forging an alliance with one of the era's most explosive talents, and Charles intended to seize that opportunity. Chapter 110. Douglas Barrett. Charles sat back, eyes narrowing as he recalled the legend of Douglas Barrett, known across the seas as the heir of the devil and lauded by many as the successor of the ghost. Barrett's story began in a grim childhood army where every boy was stripped of his name and simply called a bullet, assigned a number instead. He was bullet number 9, serving under a commander named Douglas. Over time, his designation, Douglas's 9th bullet, fused into the name Douglas Barrett. From the moment he set foot on the battlefield, Barrett's talent was obvious. Even as a youth, his power was astonishing. He cut swaths through enemy lines and time and again saved his comrades. Villagers and soldiers alike hailed him as a hero. But when the kingdom he'd bled for betrayed him, Douglas Barrett was forced into exile. It was during that dark chapter that Barrett crossed paths with the pirate king Gol D Roger. Impressed by the boy soldier's raw might, Roger welcomed him aboard. There, Barrett earned his place as one of the crew's deadliest fighters, so formidable in fact that he rivaled Silver's Rayleigh himself. Yet Barrett never let pride cloud his purpose. He doubled his training, pushing his strength to near mythical levels. His comrades whispered that he'd become a true monster, capable of feats no ordinary human could match. Then fate struck the Roger pirates a cruel blow. Roger fell gravely ill, and not long after, he was executed. The loss shattered Barrett's resolve. The once steadfast hero slipped into paranoia and rage, his mind twisted by guilt and grief. Whatever honor he'd once carried dissolved into something darker, and the world would feel the weight of his broken spirit. Charles folded his arms, the echoes of Barrett's rise and fall stirring something uneasy within him. He knew that to face Douglas Barrett now would mean facing the fury of a legend turned nightmare, and he wondered whether any light still remained in the man once called the 9th bullet. Chapter 1. The worst prison escaper in history. A tempest of cannon fire and shattered hulls swept through the New World as Charles, once known as Charlotte in whispers, wreaked havoc island after island. From dawn until dusk, he carved his name into the roaring sea, leaving nothing but ruin in his wake. Admirals and captains alike trembled at the mention of his arrival, for whenever Charles set foot on a shore, blood and fire followed. It all came crashing down one fateful dawn when Admiral Sengoku, flanked by the legendary Vice Admiral Garp, bore down on Charles atop a fleet of marine warships. Their combined might finally tamed the whirlwind he'd become. Under Garp's thunderous fists and Sengoku's iron strategy, Charles was beaten into submission and dragged away in chains. They threw him into the bowels of Impel Down, deep beneath Marineford, where sunlight dared not tread. Assigned to level 6, reserved only for the most fearsome demons and devilish criminals, Charles found himself locked in a cell with walls as cold and black as a moonless night. But confinement was never his endgame. From the very first morning, he forced himself back into the relentless routine he'd known since childhood in the army barracks, pre-dawn drills, combat sparring against twice his weight, endurance marches through tidal waters. He honed his strength, speed, technique, and stamina until every inch of his body ached, and then pushed farther still. As days bled into weeks, whispers spread through the prison's corridors. This was no ordinary inmate. He was unstoppable steel forged in hardship. Guards tried to break him with ice baths that chilled bone, training drills that left other prisoners collapsed and bleeding, but Charles only responded with snarls, eyes blazing. Weakness, he believed, was a death sentence at sea. He had seen traitors and cowards perish by the dozen. He would be neither. Then came Blackbeard's rampage. Chaos erupted as Marshal D. Teach unleashed an assault on Impel Down itself. Sirens howled, walls shuddered, and the other Nenmates, eager to seize freedom, slew each other in the confusion. In the swirl of carnage, Charles struck. He overpowered two massive guards, tore through a blast door, and sprinted into the twisting lower tunnels. With every footfall, he could almost taste the world outside. By the time the dust settled, Charles had vanished. The Marines scoured every cell. Some were empty, some stained crimson, but none held him. The government dispatch crackled across the seas. Impel Down's most notorious prisoner has escaped. He shall forever be known as the worst prison escaper in history. Free once more, Charles wasted no time. He sought out Festa, a pirate captain with a lust for spectacle, and together they launched an audacious strike on the Grand Pirate Expo, a floating bazaar of treasures, weapons, and fools bold enough to show their faces. Explosions lit the night sky as Charles cut through guards, his face betraying nothing but grim satisfaction. Every swing of his blade, every thunderous punch, was a testament to the power he had forged in chains. Amid the smoke and falling debris, Charles surveyed the carnage with cold eyes. He trusted no one. He had learned that lesson too often. Friends had betrayed him, allies had abandoned him, and mercy was a fleeting illusion. Now, the only truth he accepted was that raw strength was all that mattered. It alone would carry him further than any alliance, deeper than any prison. As the final shrine of the Expo smoldered behind him, Charles let his breath settle. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would become stronger still. He had only one creed: believe in your own power, rely on no one, and claim every victory with your bare hands. The seas might be vast, and the world might teem with dangers, but Charles Machado, soldier, prisoner, pirate, would rise above them all. And no chain, no wall, no enemy would ever hold him again. Charles possessed what was known as the super combination fruit, an ability to reshape and fuse any inorganic material he touched. With a thought, he could meld scrap metal, shattered stone, broken glass, and countless other remnants into flawless new forms. Need a battleship? He gathered iron from nearby shipwrecks and piece by piece wove it together beneath his fingertips. Crave impenetrable armor? He summoned fragments of rubble, rearranged their molecular bonds, and wrapped himself in a shell harder than diamond. Among those who wielded awakened devil fruits, none rivaled Barrett in prowess. A veteran of endless wars, Barrett had spent his life on battlefields where his power became an inexhaustible arsenal. Swords, cannons, even submarines, whatever weapon you could imagine, Barrett could forge it from the detritus of war. His combination ability extended across a vast radius, allowing him to collect every scrap within sight and transform it instantly into instruments of devastation. Yet behind Barrett's fearsome reputation lay a lifetime of sorrow. He had never known peace away from the roar of conflict, and in witnessing Barrett's mastery, Charles felt the crushing weight of his own powerlessness. Barrett's tragic fate only deepened Charles's longing. If such unrivaled might could be his, he believed he could finally escape his miserable circumstances and rewrite his destiny. Determined, Charles resolved to claim that power for himself, and in doing so, change his life forever. Charles had always been certain he could win young Barrett, only 7 or 8 years old, over to his side. He believed that, spared the cruel disappointments he himself had endured, Barrett could become the perfect ally. The boy was an orphan, hungry for family ties, and Charles already had a plan. Treat Barrett as the little brother he'd never had, perhaps even name him deputy captain. If Irina could accept Paris as her sister, Charles reasoned, surely he could forge the same bond with Barrett. Perched on the bow, Charles couldn't suppress a triumphant smile as he scanned the horizon. Paul and Isaac exchanged uneasy glances and shrugged off his glee as just another one of his mez. More than an hour passed before Charles caught sight of a dark shape looming ahead. He shot to his feet, heart pounding. They had arrived. This island, fabled as a battlefield where peace was but a rumor, beckoned them. The ship hadn't even docked when Charles, overcome by excitement, leapt toward the shore, eager to stake his claim. Who goes there? Charles's sudden movement sent the kingdom's soldiers guarding the pier into a panic. In an instant, they leveled their spears and swords at him. Frowning, Charles took in the tense faces around him, armed men who seemed ready to strike at the slightest provocation. All he'd intended was to step onto dry land. "Pirate! A pirate's come ashore!" One of the captain's uniformed men stumbled back, recognition flashing in his eyes. Before Charles could speak, the captain dropped his weapon and bolted. At that signal, the rest of the soldiers broke formation and fled in every direction. Within moments, over a dozen guards had cleared the area, leaving Charles alone on the quiet pier. He shook his head. Soldiers these days had no backbone, but then he reminded himself any decent pirate captain would know his name. After all, Charles was one of the most notorious scourges of the seas, especially in the New World. It was only natural they'd recognized him. "All right, men," Charles called to his crew aboard the ship, already easing into dock. "Boss, we've arrived." One by one, more than 20 of his crew leapt onto the pier. Arena helped haul Panis off the gangplank. Charles turned to them with a curt nod. "Leave a handful to guard the vessel. The rest of you gather supplies. We won't stay portside any longer than we have to." Obediently, the pirates dispersed, some heading to the hold with barrels and crates, others striding toward the town's provisions. Charles watched them go, a faint grin tugging at his lips. Let the merchants whisper. Tonight, the sea's most feared pirate crew would restock and set sail again under his command. Charles glanced back at his crew and called out, "Elena and I will scout the island's interior. Send a signal if anything comes up." His order cut through the morning air. "Aye, boss," came the unified reply. Satisfied, Charles turned to Elena. She hesitated, her boots rooted to the sandy beach, but Charles's steady gaze brooked no argument. Gently, he slipped his hand into hers and led her inland. Parrish trailed behind them in quick, eager steps. On the shore, Paul and Isaac exchanged a look. "I'll stay and guard the boat," Isaac volunteered before Paul could speak. Paul nodded and assembled a dozen sailors. "We'll check out the market town," he said, and the men hurried off toward the island's lone settlement. No sooner had they left than a breathless figure came racing down the path. It was the same squad leader who'd fled back to the ship earlier. Now he barreled toward the nearby military camp, shouting, "It's bad, terrible. The famed swordsman with a 1 billion Bailey bounty, the bloody swordsman, Pirate Charles, has landed." His frantic cry reached the ears of General Douglas, who was inspecting the barracks. The general's hand shot up as if to call for silence, but his lips parted instead. "Did you say Pirate Charles? The one who slipped past Admiral Chambord? Here on this island?" The camp fell into an uneasy hush, broken only by the general's sharply intoned question and the distant footsteps of Charles and Elena pressing deeper into the jungle. Remember, Chapter 111, General Twain. For centuries, the world government's propaganda has instilled an unshakable dread of the Admiral in every corner of the globe. If Charles truly slipped through the Admiral's grasp, his power must be extraordinary. Captain Douglas snapped to attention. "General Twain, I've seen it with my own eyes. Charles has just landed on the island." General Twain frowned as he considered the implications. A man who could escape the Admiral was far beyond ordinary opponents. Their kingdom's army could not afford a clash with someone of that caliber. After a moment's silent thought, he spoke. "Very well," he said. "Douglas, muster your men. I want a full escort. We'll go and greet this world-famous pirate ourselves." Douglas hesitated, eyes wide. "Sir, with all due respect, that pirate carries a 1 billion berry bounty. What if he's hostile toward our island? What if he orders an attack?" General Twain cut him off with a steady gaze. "And if he does, tell me, Douglas, what can you do about it?" The captain opened his mouth, then shut it again under the weight of the general's stare. Twain leaned in, his voice low and unwavering. "We leave at first light. Prepare the guard. We'll show Charles exactly who holds command here." With that, General Twain turned on his heel and strode away, Douglas hurrying behind to carry out the order. The die was cast. They would face the legendary pirate in person. Charles stammered, "This." Douglas fell silent. Of course, if the notorious pirate with a 1 billion belly price truly had a soft spot for them, There was nothing they could do except wait for the end. He squared his shoulders and met the general's steady gaze. The general nodded with satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Lead me to the man who rules these waters." Without a single guard in tow, the general strode off, Douglas close at his side. He'd insisted on no escort. Any show of force might only rile Charles's temper. Charles guided Elena through the gates and into the small town beyond. At first glance, the place seemed oddly still. Stalls lined the streets, yet the chatter of merchants and customers was muted, like a stage after the play has ended. The pair walked on, the silence pressing in until Charles felt a chill run down his spine. "Elena," he murmured, leaning in close so only she could hear. Her lips parted in surprise. "Yes? Have you noticed? Almost all the vendors are elderly men or women. There aren't any children, hardly any men of fighting age either." Elena's eyes flicked from one empty stall to the next. She shivered. Charles drew a breath and pushed onward, determined to uncover why this town seemed so strangely deserted. Charles and Elena rounded the corner into the town's main street and stopped. All around them were frail old women and a handful of wide-eyed children. No adult men, no teenagers. The shops were shuttered. Even the usual street vendors were gone. "How is this possible?" Elena whispered, her brow knitting in confusion. Charles shook his head. "This region is fractured into 5 or maybe 6 warring kingdoms. Battles flare up almost daily. One of those realms even calls itself the Endless War. They conscript every able-bodied man they can find, and they train children to fight alongside them. A bullet from a 12-year-old is just as lethal as one from a veteran soldier." Elena bit her lip, staring at Charles in horror. "You're saying they've drafted all the men, and the boys too?" He gave a slow, sorrowful nod. "Exactly. They're desperate for numbers, no matter the cost." "This is barbaric," Elena breathed. She glanced at the tattered banners fluttering overhead, each bearing a different crest. "Why go to such lengths? Are they fighting over land?" Charles rubbed the back of his neck, his expression grim. "Not just land. Power, resources, control. In these kingdoms, any advantage can tip the balance, even if it means sending children onto the battlefield." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She'd seen horrors traveling with Charles these past months, but this cruelty froze her blood. Together, they pressed on down the empty street, hearts heavy with the knowledge that here, innocence itself was being torn apart by war. "Or is there some other reason you can't live in peace?" Elena asked, her brow furrowing as she looked at Charles. He offered a non-committal shrug. "I really can't say. Maybe it's clashing interests, or someone pulling strings behind the scenes, or it could be any number of other factors." Charles spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty, and suddenly the bustle around them died away. He turned his gaze down the street. A middle-aged man in a black military uniform and peaked cap was striding toward them, flanked by a younger officer. Charles recognized the younger man as the captain who detained him at the port. The moment the general set foot on the street, the clip-clop of horses and the rumble of carts fell silent. The townspeople froze, their eyes locked on the newcomer. In their expressions, Charles saw not only fear, but something colder, resentment. He calmly drew Irina and Panis to his side and raised an eyebrow at their approach. The general stopped a few paces away, snapped to attention, and gave Charles a crisp salute. "Welcome to Jartsburg, Mr. Charles, and to your wife," he said with solemn respect. "Welcome to Jartsburg. I'm Don Sitney, the island's garrison general. Please, call me General Sitney." Charles inclined his head in acknowledgement. The general let out a soft sigh of relief. He'd worried this newcomer might be one of those arrogant pirates who refused to speak and did as they pleased, making it impossible to predict their next move. But Charles showed no sign of impatience. Clearing his throat, Sitney set aside his formalities and got straight to the point. "May I ask how you arrived on our shores, Mr. Charles?" Charles frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Why do I owe you an explanation?" Sitney's brows twitched, as though he'd just been handed his death sentence. He forced himself to smile and quickly raised a hand in apology. "Forgive my forwardness. I meant no offense, only it's not every day we see a lone traveler appear so abruptly." "I apologize for my abruptness," Tang En said, bowing once more. Douglas at his side hurriedly mirrored the gesture. "Honestly, we only came to rest and restock our supplies for a few days. You don't need to worry about us. So long as no one here gives us trouble, nothing untoward will happen. Charles waved him off with a casual flick of his hand and met Tang En's eyes. Of course, you're welcome here, and I'll personally ensure no one interferes. Tang En's cheeks flushed with suppressed anger. As long as no one bothers you, nothing bad will happen? Was that a veiled threat? Perhaps, but what choice did he have? He forced a genial smile. Rest assured, everything here will meet your expectations. You won't run into any troublemakers. Charles nodded once, his expression calm and unreadable. Then he paused, as if recollecting something important, and fixed Tang En with a direct gaze. Actually, there's one more favor I'd like you to do. Will you help me with it? Absolutely, Tang En replied without hesitation, though his tight smile barely concealed his unease. I'm at your service. Chapter 112, Finding Barrett Tang, and didn't hesitate. Before Charles could even finish his sentence, Tang En nodded and said, All right, I'm in. Charles blinked in surprise at the instantaneous agreement, then threw back his head and laughed loudly. Ha! That's exactly why I like you, so straightforward and decisive. Tang En, typically grave, forced a tight smile in response. The result was a little awkward, but Charles didn't seem to mind. Internally, Tang En was seething. Letting that old man go had been a reckless move. What if he turned informant? But here he was, grinning like an idiot under praise he neither wanted nor trusted. Changing the subject quickly, Charles fixed Tang En with a sharp look. Do you have a Captain Douglas serving under you? Before Tang En could answer, the man at his side, his actual Captain Douglas, shivered visibly. Captain Douglas was impossible to miss. Tall, lean, with hawk-like eyes that scanned everyone in the room. Now those eyes darted to Tang En in confusion, and a cold sweat broke out along his temples. Douglas? Tang En echoed, feigning surprise as he followed Charles's gaze over to his lieutenant. He half whispered, Are you asking about him? But Charles already knew. His own face was calm, almost smug, as he watched Douglas shift uncomfortably. That silent acknowledgement told Tang En everything. Charles had done his homework, and this captain wasn't part of the official station roster. A chill passed through the small office. Tang En recovered his composure quickly, but the tension between them had spiked. Charles leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and said softly, Interesting. I may have more questions about Captain Douglas before this is over. As Douglas wiped his brow, Tang En realized that the next move would have to be made very carefully. Charles held more cards here than he'd let on. And now, with the existence of Captain Douglas out in the open, all their carefully guarded secrets were at risk of being exposed. Tang En glanced nervously at the team leader beside him. Had he just offended Charles? Why else would Charles be asking him about Captain Douglas when the man in question was standing right there? If Charles were truly angry, he wouldn't bother with pleasantries. Mr. Charles, what perfect timing, Tang En said with forced cheer. He stepped forward and gently steered the rigid figure of Captain Douglas until the man stood directly before Charles. The Captain Douglas you're looking for is right here. Charles stared at the captain's trembling form, disbelief and excitement warring in his chest. Fate worked in strange ways. He hadn't expected to find Douglas so easily. If he'd tried to locate Barrett by blind guesswork, he could have searched for a year without uncovering a single lead. But once he had Douglas, everything would fall into place. After all, it was this very Captain Douglas who dragged Barrett into the Boy Scouts' death squad when Barrett was just a boy. With Douglas in hand, finding Barrett would be a simple matter. A triumphant smile curved Charles's lips as he regarded the captain. At last, the path to Barrett lay wide open. Charles fixed his gaze on Captain Douglas. I hear you have a Boy Scout squad under your command. Is that right? Douglas, who had been on edge, froze for a moment at the unexpected question. He forced out a nod. In this army, recruiting and training youths wasn't considered dishonorable. Many officers kept such squads for their own clandestine use. Young fighters, once armed, could be just as lethal as seasoned soldiers. On the battlefield, these scouts often spearheaded assaults, their fearlessness turning them into effective shock troops. I need to find someone, Charles continued, his voice steady. He might be among your Boy Scouts. I'd like to meet them. Douglas opened his mouth, ready to stall, but no words came. Before he could recover, Lieutenant General Tang En, stepped forward with a reassuring smile. "Certainly," Tang said. "We can arrange it at once." He gave Dougal as an encouraging nod and a conspiratorial wink. The captain's bravado crumbled into a cold sweat. He had every intention of refusing what had possessed him to agree so quickly. "My lord, please follow me," Douglas urged, glancing back at Charles. Charles's pulse quickened. "Barrett, your future aid won't slip from my grasp." The thought sent a thrill racing through him, so intense that Irina, who'd been holding his arm, felt a subtle vibration in his touch. Something about Charles today struck her as odd, but Elena offered no comment and simply fell in step beside him. Together with Douglas and Tang En, the five of them left the narrow street and ventured into the heart of Jaltsburg. The neat rows of townhouses faded away, replaced by sprawling military camps. Soldiers drilled in precise formations, their movements sharp and disciplined. Charles took in the scene, and Tang En, pride lighting his eyes, began to introduce his troops. "These men and women are under my command. They're the kingdom's elite. Each one is a battle-hardened survivor." As Tang En spoke, Charles sensed a faint, lethal aura radiating from the soldiers, an aura unique to every individual, a silent testament to the lives they'd taken and the battles they'd endured. What was certain was that these men had, no doubt, already taken lives. "Not bad," Charles said, nodding once. "Just what you'd expect from a nation that's been at war forever." He studied the soldiers before him. Disciplined, ruthless, each bearing the bearing of an elite Navy Marine. Tang En's lips curved into a proud smile. Praise like Charles's, from a pirate of his fame, was something any commander would cherish. And during their journey together, Tang En had discovered that Charles wasn't the merciless brute the Navy had painted him to be. He suspected their own Navy had deliberately spread lies to discredit the pirate captain. Elena, meanwhile, had finally discovered where the local men and children had been taken. They'd been herded into this massive military encampment, and the sight made her skin crawl. She shot General Tang En a look of thinly veiled disgust. The soldiers patrolling the camp either stared with empty eyes or wore expressions so cruel they seemed carved from hatred. It was terrifying. The children were no better off. Some stared blankly into space, as though their young hearts had gone numb. Others had eyes that danced with a mad sort of fearlessness, an utter contempt for death. Charles frowned at the grim tableau. None of it boded well for the souls trapped inside those walls. He felt firm hands steady his arms and glanced up at Elena's worried face. He couldn't help a small sigh. Elena was far too kind, but in moments like this, kindness was a blessing. Thanks to General Tang En's reputation, they passed through the barracks without a single soldier daring to stop them for inspection. Tang En's name was like a golden passport. Before long, Douglas had escorted the three of them to their assigned camp. "My lord, please wait a moment," Douglas said. "I'll gather the Boy Scouts under my command." Within minutes, he returned leading a group of eager young lads and guided Charles to a broad clearing. A simple raised platform stood at its center, just high enough for everyone to see who stood atop it. Charles gave Douglas a nod of thanks, then stepped up and surveyed the scene. Aside from a handful of adult soldiers, almost everyone here was a child. Boys of 9 to 12 years old filled the camp, more than half the population. Charles scanned the faces, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't spot Barrett anywhere. Chapter 113. Your name is Barrett. Phew! A sharp blast of the assembly whistle cut through Charles's thoughts. Captain Douglas pressed the polished metal to his lips and blew again, the sound reverberating across the parade grounds. Within moments, every soldier in the battalion dropped what they were doing and marched onto the field. 5 minutes later, the square was filled with ranks of men standing at attention, rifles shouldered, eyes fixed straight ahead. Charles couldn't help but admire Douglas's command. The captain's reputation was already well known, but it was his uncanny ability to turn raw recruits into a disciplined fighting force that truly set him apart. Before Charles, 2 columns faced each other, the younger recruits on the left, the seasoned adults on the right. The contrast was striking. Every line was impeccably straight, every uniform immaculately worn. It was a testament to Douglas's rigorous standards and relentless drills. Charles turned his gaze to the youths. Most were barely over 5 feet tall, their features still soft with boyhood. Yet one figure towered above them all. Nearly 2 meters tall, this lanky newcomer stood like a giant among boys, his height impossible to miss even at a glance. Charles raised an eyebrow. In a youth camp where few recruits measured more than 1.5 meters, this mysterious giant made quite an impression. His name, Charles had already learned, was Barrett, and somehow Charles sensed that this recruit's arrival would change everything. Charles held his gaze without a second thought. The other boy hesitated, then met his eyes. In that moment, Charles knew this was Douglas Barrett. Although Barrett might only be his code name now, the famed bullet soldier number, the sharp brilliance in his gaze and the taut strength in his stance confirmed it. A smile curled on Charles's lips as he beckoned to the captain posted below deck. "He's the one I want. Bring him up here." His tone brooked no argument. Captain Douglas followed Charles's outstretched finger, then frowned. "Sir, are you sure?" "Positive," Charles replied, his voice firm. "Now." At his side, Tang En gave Douglas a discreet but insistent tap on the shoulder. With a reluctant nod, Douglas turned to the hatch and called down in a crisp voice, "Bullet soldier number, report to the deck, now!" A moment later, a surprisingly youthful voice answered, ringing clearly from below. Yet when the hatch opened, a nearly 2-meter-tall figure climbed into the light, every inch the seasoned soldier Charles had come to find. Commander Douglas barked, "Disperse!" The soldiers broke rank at once, filing away without a single complaint. When the courtyard fell silent, Douglas turned to Charles. "My lord, the man you requested has arrived." He strode toward the raised platform, his colossal lieutenant close behind. Soldier number stood over 2 meters tall, his broad shoulders almost eclipsing Douglas himself. At the top of the steps, Douglas knelt and bowed. "Sir, he is here." Douglas's voice carried an edge of frustration. He had raised this boy from childhood, molding him into his personal champion, certain that one day the youth's terrifying strength would secure Douglas's greatest victory. Yet now Charles ignored him completely, never even glancing in his direction. Instead, Charles fixed his cool gaze on the towering soldier at his side. "How old are you?" Charles asked. Soldier No stiffened, blinking in surprise. He looked first at Charles, then at Douglas, as though uncertain whom he should answer. Charles's eyebrows drew together in a frown. From the sidelines, General Tang En, who had been watching Charles's expression closely, stepped forward and snapped, "Answer his question, soldier!" "Soldiers, report!" The young trooper snapped to attention in a heartbeat. "Sir, I'm 8 years old this year." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, everyone except Charles and Douglas, the boy's guardian. 8 years old, and standing nearly 2 meters tall? It was unbelievable. Before Tang En could voice his astonishment, Charles raised a hand to forestall him. Turning to the towering child, he offered a warm smile. "How would you like to join my unit?" At those words, Tang En and Douglas exchanged relieved glances, while Elena looked on in surprised delight. The boy himself blinked, clearly taken aback. To be invited so kindly by someone a full head taller, he hadn't expected it. General Tang En recovered first. "Soldier, obey that order." "Ah, yes, sir!" The boy snapped to attention again, voice steady. Charles shot Tang En a quick look, his expression soft but confident. He knew this was the right move. As the young soldier stood ready, Charles felt the first spark of something extraordinary forming in his new recruit. Charles knew there was no point in explaining at length. Convincing an 8-year-old soldier to follow him required simplicity above all else. He looked down at the boy known only as No, Bullet Soldier, and asked, "What's your name?" The child hesitated, then replied with a crisp salute. "Reporting, sir. I don't have a name, only a code name. Mine is Bullet 9. His face stayed impassive, as though he'd said it 1,000 times. Charles nodded once, sharply. "Fine, I'll give you a real name." He tapped his chin theatrically. "Bullet Soldier Num. From now on, you're Barrett." He paused, then glanced over at Captain Douglas. "And for your last name, Douglas Barrett. Does that work?" The boy's eyes flickered, just for an instant, but his expression remained calm. "Thank you, sir," he said, switching back to military formality. "All right, Barrett," Charles said, slipping easily back into command. "Let's move. From now on, you sail with me, and you'll be a pirate," Charles announced, locking eyes with Barrett. "Joining my crew means you'll be one of us. Understood?" Barrett's face, long unreadable, betrayed a flicker of doubt. His military upbringing had taught him to view pirates as nothing more than outlaws. Before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Why hesitate? You'd count yourself fortunate to serve under Lord Charles." General Tang thundered from the sidelines. Barrett started, caught off guard by the general's sudden command. Confusion swirled through him, but reflex won out. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and spoke with firm clarity. "Yes, my lord, I swear my loyalty." A triumphant smile spread across Charles's face. He nodded gratefully at Tang En. Thanks to the general's timely intervention, he had just secured the allegiance of one more powerful ally. Chapter 114, Tang En's Banquet. That evening, Charles led his small company, Elena, heavily pregnant, the young Penice, and their newly enlisted comrade Barrett, to the hilltop fortress of General Tang En. Having just taken Barrett under his command, Charles found himself with a rare free night. When the general extended an invitation to dine at his estate, Charles seized the chance. Free food and drink at a friendly lord's table was an offer he couldn't refuse. Confident in his reputation, he didn't even hire a separate boatman or extra guards. Who, after all, would dare sneak aboard the flagship of one of the realm's most feared captains? They arrived at the castle by nightfall and stepped into a great hall ablaze with torchlight. Lively chatter and the clink of goblets filled the air as guests exchanged banter and toasts. General Tang En greeted them warmly. Charles returned the salute, then joined the circle of officers raising their cups. Elena, mindful of her condition, claimed a seat beside Penice and Barrett at a small side table piled with fruit and sweetmeats. She sipped chilled fruit juice, her eyes bright as laughter rang out around her. Charles had also made sure the two boys drank only juice or milk, far younger and far too precious for wine. For Barrett, who'd grown up in the strict discipline of the barracks, the banquet was nothing short of miraculous. The scent of roasted birds and spiced pies wove through the hall. Platters of candied fruits and glazed pastries gleamed beneath the torches. Penice stared in wonder, scarcely believing such abundance. After checking with Elena, both lads eagerly tucked in, sampling plate after plate of delicacies. Music rose as minstrels struck up a tune, and the feast rolled on long into the night. Laughter, storytelling, and renewed friendships bound the participants together. For Charles, so often pressed by duty, the evening's warmth and camaraderie felt almost like a dream. Under the watchful gaze of General Tang En, he allowed himself to relax, grateful for this rare hour of comfort among allies. Barrett didn't even pause between bites. Before anyone knew it, he'd cleared the entire table. Paris, sitting beside him, couldn't help herself and muttered under her breath, "What a monster!" Barrett's hearing was razor sharp. He froze mid-chew the instant he registered her words. Elena, watching the scene, couldn't help but smile. "Paris, that's enough," she chided gently, her pregnancy glow lending a warm authority to her voice. "Barrett, don't mind her. Eat all you like. If you're still hungry afterward, we've got plenty more." Elated by Elena's encouragement, Barrett relaxed and resumed eating, this time with quieter enjoyment. The wild, almost desperate look he'd worn vanished, replaced by a calm contentment. Elena watched him for a moment, her eyes soft with affection, before her gaze drifted across the hall to Charles, the young man who declared himself a pirate just that morning. Barrett noticed Elena's attention shift and followed her line of sight. There, standing a few yards away, was Charles, tall, confident, and impossibly intriguing. Elena's smile faltered. She grew suddenly aware of how long she'd been staring. Blushing, she looked away, but Barrett simply leaned back, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. The two of them fell silent, each pondering the newcomer whose arrival had already shaken up their quiet world. Charles turned his gaze back to the two youngsters. 10-year-old Panis stared around the grand hall, her eyes alight with curiosity. At the same time, Barrett was still silently tearing into his meal at an alarming pace, which drew a worried look from Elena. "Barrett, are you sure you can handle all that?" Elena asked in a gentle voice. The moment Barrett heard her, he froze mid-bite and carefully set his plate down. "Huh? Am I still hungry?" he mumbled, glancing sheepishly at her. Elena raised an eyebrow. "But you just finished eating. Didn't that fill you up?" Barrett gave a small nod and an even smaller grunt. Thanks to his unusual metabolism, he'd been perpetually famished since childhood. No feast had ever seemed enough. Elena's heart softened. "Poor boy," she murmured, sliding her own plate across the table toward him. Panis, catching the kindness in Elena's gesture, pushed her meal forward as well. Barrett stared at the two generous portions in front of him. For a moment, his eyes grew misty, overwhelmed by their unexpected generosity. This was a first for Charles, and the rush left him almost speechless. Unsure how to respond, he simply helped himself to the food laid out before him, eating in quiet wonder. Tang En watched in admiration as Charles downed an entire bottle in one go. "Ha! Captain Charles really can drink." Charles laughed along with the crowd. "What can I say? I'm a man who can keep it going all day and into the night." He lifted his bottle high, meeting the eager eyes around him. "Captain Charles is truly a world-class legend. Give it up for me." The hall erupted in cheers and applause. Grinning, Charles urged them on. "Let's drink. If you're not hammered, you can't call it a party." "Long live the boss," came the shout. "Captain Charles forever." The roars of approval filled the room, and Charles reveled in it. After another round, or two, he surprised them all by remaining perfectly sober. He shook his head briskly to clear the fog, then spotted Elena and her two companions across the hall. "Excuse me," he announced to his cheering fans. "I'll be over there." With that, he set down his bottle and made his way toward Elena, the faint scent of liquor trailing behind him. Irina folded her arms and scowled. "Why are you here? You reek of alcohol." Elena sniffed in disgust. Charles caught the scent on his own breath and rubbed his forehead. "I came to see you. Has dinner been served?" He glanced around the room. At one table, Barrett was tucking into a hearty meal. At another, Elena and a maid named Paris sat with only a couple of bottles of juice and milk in front of them. Charles' eyes narrowed. "Then why isn't my wife being served?" The maids froze, fear flickering across their faces. Elena rolled her eyes. "I told them not to serve her. I'm already full. What's the point of giving her any?" Ileana shot Charles a curious look. He forced a smile and shifted gears. "Barrett, how's everything? Enjoying your dinner?" Charles clapped a hand on Barrett's broad shoulder. Barrett paused mid-bite, then nodded awkwardly. "Ha! Yes, it's very good." Charles laughed and gave that shoulder a friendly squeeze. "That's better. Don't look like you're about to fight someone." Elena tugged him by the sleeve. "Come on, Charles. Let him eat in peace." "Am I terrifying?" Charles asked Elena, a playful glint in his eye. Elena stopped in her tracks, speechless. "Worried about scaring people? You're a massive pirate already wanted for 1 billion berries." At that, Barrett, snacking nearby, paused mid-bite. He may have been only 8, but he fully understood the staggering weight of a 1 billion-berry bounty. Wide-eyed, he looked up at his future captain with equal parts awe and excitement. Charles laughed, tossing his hair back. 1 billion berries? The Navy's assessment was laughably low. My true worth and my bounty will climb well beyond that. Elena's lips curved into an amused smirk. But Charles only had eyes for the real target of his irritation, Patrick Redfield, the so-called Red Earl, whose own sky-high bounty clearly went straight to his head. With a flash of anger, Charles resolved that it was high time someone put that haughty Earl back in his place. Chapter 115. Charles's Condition. Elena folded her arms and rolled her eyes. "Really impressive, Charles," she teased. "But didn't the Admiral just put out another bounty on your head? Aren't you being hunted all over the world?" Charles's grin faltered for a moment, only to return with renewed enthusiasm. "Of course I am," he laughed. "I'm a pirate. Why wouldn't the Royal Navy be after me?" His laughter echoed across the deck. After all, being chased by warships was part of the pirate's life. Yet when he glanced at Barrett, the sight unsettled him. Barrett sat quietly, staring at Charles with an odd, distant expression. It was as though the boy were watching some grand spectacle that Charles couldn't see. "Barrett?" Charles said, stepping closer. Barrett's eyes locked onto his, still holding that strange intensity. Charles shook his head and laughed again. "Listen to me. When I officially become a pirate, the Navy won't give me a moment's peace. Do you think you're ready for that kind of life?" Barrett's vacant gaze crystallized into resolve. He squared his shoulders and met Charles's eyes head-on. "No," he said firmly. "I won't run. If they come for us, I'll stand and fight." Charles studied him for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. The boy was serious, ready to face danger without flinching. and in that instant, Charles knew their fates were sealed together. Two unlikely comrades, bound by the chase of the high seas. Charles froze for a moment at Barrett's words, then broke into a broad grin. "Ha ha! You're right, Barrett. But fighting isn't just about skill. You need strength." He waved a hand dismissively. He could puzzle out the details later. "I'll become strong. You'll see." Barrett's eyes glittered. Growing up in a military camp had taught him one thing, strength above all. He balled his fists, unable to hide his excitement at the promise of real power. Charles clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. From today on, you'll train with me. I'll show you how to become strong." Raising his fist, Charles summoned a rumbling presence around his arm. In an instant, his forearm turned jet black, wreathed in a sickly green haze that made Barrett's head spin. Barrett leaned closer, awe and curiosity warring in his expression. "What is that?" Charles allowed a confident smirk. "This is armed color domination, one of the 3 color dominations. It boosts both offense and defense, and lets you harness the natural flow of power. Stick with me, and I'll teach you everything." Armament Haki in Wano country is known as Ryusakura, but it isn't exactly the same as the armament Haki practiced in the outside world. Ryusakura is an advanced form, what you might call mobile armament Haki, that can be projected beyond the body. Mastering this external application is a crucial step toward true power. Charles explained this to Barrett as they walked along the deck. "In the original tale," he said with a wry smile, "Barrett's armament Haki was positively terrifying. He unleashed such a massive surge that it blanketed an entire island in an instant, the most overwhelming display of armament Haki anyone had ever seen. And yet, he still lost to Luffy. At the thought of that raw, bristling power, Barrett's eyes lit up. "Teach me how to do that," he demanded. "Very well," Charles replied, ruffling Barrett's hair. "Once you're back on my ship, I'll show you every technique I know." Barrett straightened and saluted with a broad grin. "Yes, Captain." Charles returned the salute with a satisfied nod. Barrett's eagerness was exactly the kind of determination he liked to see, proof that, together, they might conquer even the toughest challenges ahead. Charles strode away toward the center of the banquet hall. Tang En had been watching him, and as soon as Charles turned back, Tang En hurried forward. "Captain Charles, I need a favor." He slipped his arm around Charles's and guided him into a quiet corner. Charles frowned at the sudden request, and Tang En, noticing the hesitation, rushed to sweeten the deal. "I'll pay you. How about a devil fruit?" At the mention of a devil fruit, Charles's brow eased. He leaned in. "Go on. What do you want me to do?" A faint smile flickered on Tang En's lips as he met Charles's gaze. "I want you to bring the whole island under my control." Charles paused. Unifying an island was hardly beyond his abilities, but one devil fruit for such a feat? He studied Tang En for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but one devil fruit won't cut it. If you really want me to conquer this island, you'll have to give me 2. "Here's my proposal," Charles announced, holding up 5 fingers. He understood that the island was split into 6 nations. If he wanted to unite them all, he'd have to break the other 5. General Tang En stared, stunned. He'd expected Charles to drive a hard bargain, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. Even with 5 devil fruits at his disposal, the general knew they wouldn't be enough to topple 5 kingdoms. He clenched his jaw and muttered under his breath, cursing Charles's greed. Charles caught every syllable. He felt Tang En's hand still resting on his arm, a subtle sign of unease, but showed no reaction. In the world of negotiations, a bold offer was just the start. 5 devil fruits is outrageous, Tang En protested. "I can't decide this on my own. I must report to His Majesty the King." As a dutiful general, Tang En was bound to seek royal approval. His cautious tone made it clear this meeting was as much a test of Charles's resolve as a business discussion. Charles shrugged casually. "Very well. I'll stay here 2 days. Use that time to decide." With that, he settled in, his gaze never leaving Tang En's face. The clock was ticking, and Charles's grand design for the island hung in the balance. Charles raised his wineglass and moved toward the center of the banquet hall, weaving through officers and crew as he laughed and chatted. In a shadowed corner, General Tang En stood alone, silent and watchful. The celebration stretched past midnight, and eventually a very unsteady Charles was gently guided home by Elena. The next morning, Charles awoke with a pounding headache. He wasn't much of a drinker, but in the ruthless world of pirates, one's capacity for liquor was often mistaken for strength of character, and Charles was determined not to appear weak. He groaned, propping himself up on one elbow. Elena appeared in the doorway with a steaming bowl of restorative broth. "Here, this should help," she said, setting it on the bedside table. He accepted it gratefully. "Thanks, Elena. By the way, General Tang En showed up before dawn. He's been waiting outside. He wants to see me." Elena's eyes flicked up. "Already? Have you heard what he decided?" Charles thought back to the terms he'd laid out the night before and marveled at how quickly Tang En had agreed. "Apparently. I'm going to meet him now." With that, he set the bowl aside, stood, and donned his formal uniform over a crisp shirt. Bracing himself against the lingering ache in his head, Charles opened the door and stepped into the corridor, ready for whatever came next. Chapter 116, Destruction of a Country in One Day. A booming laugh rang through the hallway. "Ha! So General Dunn has made up his mind?" Tang En, who had been pacing just outside the royal audience chamber, froze at the sound of that familiar voice. He darted toward the door as it swung open. Before him stood Charles Dunn, formerly known as Charlotte, grinning from ear to ear. "Sir Charles!" Tang En exclaimed, bowing hastily. "The king has given his full consent. If you conquer an entire nation, you'll be granted a devil fruit as your reward, and any treasures you claim during the campaign are yours to keep." Charles's eyes gleamed at the news. He clenched his fists. "That's perfect. I can't wait to get started. Can we march out right now?" Tang En shook his head, concern creasing his brow. "Not quite yet. You know each of the 5 kingdoms maintains about 25,000 standing troops, over 100,000 soldiers in total. We need time to assemble our forces, secure supply lines, and scout enemy positions." At that, Charles broke into an easy grin. "Logistics, reconnaissance, supply lines, got it. But none of that will slow us down. Let's get our generals briefed and our banners raised. By dawn tomorrow, I want our armies on the march." Relieved that Charles understood the stakes, at least in name, Tang En hurried off to sound the alarm. Outside, the city buzzed with activity as the gears of war began to turn. In less than 24 hours, a country would crumble at the thunder of Charles Dunn's advance. Charles waved off Tang En's outstretched hand with a casual flick of his wrist. 25 soldiers? They're like chickens and dogs to me. Just call them up. I'll take care of them myself." He spoke with absolute confidence. It wasn't empty boasting. When faced with true power, mere numbers meant nothing. If his opponent lacked exceptional strength, all Charles would have to do was let his presence radiate, and the ordinary foot soldiers would break under that sheer dominance without a single swing of his blade. Tang En met his gaze and, reading Charles's resolve, nodded. "Very well. Give me an hour. I'll muster the troops at once." Twain, standing nearby, ground his teeth in determination. "Count on me too. I'll be ready when you call." As Tang En hurried off, Charles settled onto a bench at the courtyard table. Quietly, Elena slipped up beside him. "Heading into another fight?" she asked softly, sliding her hand onto his shoulder. Charles looked up. "Yes." Elena's eyes sparkled with a mixture of worry and excitement. "They're offering a huge sum this time. I can't help but feel thrilled and concerned." He gave a short nod. "I know." She sighed, choosing not to argue. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "Don't worry," Charles replied, a calm smile tugging at his lips. "I don't consider this a war at all," Charles said, gently squeezing Elena's hand. After their meal, he gathered 20 of his men and set off for the barracks. Before they arrived, a messenger intercepted them with urgent orders. They were to move out at once to the border. When the men learned they'd earned 25 silver coins apiece for this duty, they cheered and braced their weapons eagerly. At the frontier line, they found 2 armies arrayed against each other, commanders at the front trading insults, tens of thousands of troops massed behind their banners. Tang En, still mid-shout, spotted Charles and hurried up. "Sir Charles, you've come." Charles held up a hand to quiet him. "These 20 will follow me?" Tang En glanced at the small detachment flanking Charles. "Yes, sir, every one of them." Without another word, Charles strode forward until he stood alone between the opposing lines. He drew the 7-star sword, its blade flashing in the morning light. Against 40 to 50,000 soldiers gathered before him, Charles cut a solitary, unshakable figure. The enemy commander-in-chief froze when a lone youth strode out before their lines. For a heartbeat, he thought the boy must be mad, until an impossible aura flared around him. Boom! A primal roar shattered the air. Charles's eyes ignited, and from his body surged a boundless, domineering power, swirling in crimson and emerald, that crashed into the front ranks like a tidal wave. Ugh! Ack! In an instant, over 50 soldiers went down, their eyes rolling back, faces ashen, foam at their lips. Even the commander-in-chief was torn from his saddle, collapsing unconscious to the blood-soaked earth. On a nearby ridge, Tang En could only stare, mouth agape. Could this boy truly be the greatest warrior on the sea continent? Dozens were felled in the blink of an eye. What cataclysmic force had just been unleashed? Then, from Charles's army came a thunderous cheer. Long live! Long live! Long live! Tang En reacted instantly, drawing the long sword at his side. Kill them! Take every head! At his command, the troops surged forward into the dazed enemy ranks and unleashed merciless slaughter. The carnage lasted all morning. By noon, the opposing force, originally 5,000 strong, had been whittled down to fewer than 100 survivors. Witnessing the butchery firsthand, Charles felt the full weight of human cruelty. With the enemy vanquished, Tang En led his army through the broken gates of the royal capital. Standing amid the smoldering ruins he had helped create, he felt a deep, hollow satisfaction. After half his life in the field, he had finally taken this city, and yet it tasted of ash. He glanced at Charles, admiration and apprehension mingling in his eyes. There was no rest for the victors. Charles pushed onward, pressing Tang En's forces toward the next capital without pause. His presence was like a thunderclap. Wherever he marched, the defenders fell before him, the field running red once more. In just 4 days, Charles overran the remaining 4 kingdoms, an astounding feat of 1 realm conquered per day. The only thing that slowed him down was Tang En's army holding back. Otherwise, at Charles's pace, the entire campaign would have been over in 2 days. These so-called kingdoms turned out to be no more than walled city-states, scarcely large enough to warrant the fuss they'd made. Even so, Charles did meet resistance as he helped Tang En seize each royal seat. A handful of warriors, their auras crackling with power, rushed out to stop him. But to Charles, they were nothing more than speed bumps. Each fell to a single, precise stroke of his blade. Not one survived. It was only afterward that Charles discovered these attackers weren't loyal to any of the conquered thrones. Some were covert agents of the world government, others operatives of the shadowy dark forces that inevitably flourish wherever war rages. Allegiances meant nothing to him. Reveal your master's name, no matter whether you serve the dragon loan sharks or the king of assassins, and you earn death on the spot. By the time he finished clearing palace after palace for Tang En, Charles had not only secured every stronghold in the realm, but also collected a handsome reward for his efforts. Charles surveyed the royal vault in awe. The kings and nobles of this realm were unimaginably wealthy. Piles of gold coins and glittering treasures filled every corner. Even with more than 20 of his own men, Charles couldn't have carried it all off. He would have been forced to leave half the hall behind if Tang En hadn't arrived with his reinforcements at just the right moment. As they rifled through the chests, Charles's eye caught something unusual. 3 strange, glossy fruits resting on a velvet cushion. He didn't yet understand what these devil fruits were. Only later, back on Hive Island, would he learn of the incredible powers they granted their eaters. "Ha! Boss, we're rich!" Paul whooped, tossing a gold coin into the air and letting it spin before catching it. Tang En strolled up beside Charles, a triumphant grin curling his lips. Lately, neither he nor anyone else dared pull tricks on their leader. Anything that belonged to Charles was untouchable. Chapter 117, 8 Devil Fruits. Despite his excitement, Charles kept his true feelings hidden. Tang En approached him with a formal salute. "Sir Charles, thank you for your service to the kingdom." Charles waved him off. "No need for thanks. You've already paid me for this. Besides, these rival kingdoms lie in ruins, and their kings and nobles are now prisoners. When will I receive my reward?" Tang En returned his grin. Charles was in an excellent mood. This mission had proved far more lucrative than he dared hope. over 30 billion golden Baileys in bounty, 3 devil fruits seized, plus the 5 the crown had promised him. 8 devil fruits. He'd made a small fortune. To suppress his own smile. Charles said, "It's all arranged. Lead the way to the palace. The king's devil fruit awaits." With a respectful bow, Tang En replied, "Right away, sir." And together they stepped out of the courtyard, bound for Yazi Kingdom. Charles tugged on Tang En's arm, forcing him forward through the marbled corridors of Yaz Palace. Reluctantly, Tang En followed, guiding Charles toward the throne room where the court was already in uproar. "We can't. Your Majesty, you simply can't give this away," one minister protested, his voice echoing under the vaulted ceiling. His cheeks were flushed with indignation. "This is the last trump card of our kingdom. How could you possibly hand it over to a pirate?" The young king sat perfectly still, expression inscrutable. Around him, the other nobles clamored on, their voices rising in protest, but the monarch made no reply. Just as the noise threatened to overwhelm the chamber, the great doors slammed open. A palace guard strode in, his armor clinking softly in the hush that followed. "Your Majesty," he announced, bowing low, "General Twain and the great swordsman Charles have arrived." Instantly, the courtiers fell silent, every eye turning to the entrance. The king raised a slender hand and motioned them to stillness. "Enough," he said quietly. The single word cut through the tension like a blade. With solemn dignity, the guard withdrew. Moments later, 2 figures entered. General Twain, tall and imposing in his polished breastplate, and beside him, Charles, whose calm gaze swept over the assembly. Tang En stepped forward and knelt, forehead nearly touching the marble floor in a formal salute. When he rose, his posture was rigid, every muscle braced for what might come next. Charles, however, remained perfectly upright. He gave no bow, only a steady, unflinching look at the king waiting on his throne. He would never bow his head in this life. No king, no matter how powerful, could ever force Charles into submission. Their mutual contempt was an open secret. More than one monarch before had chosen to end their own lives rather than endure his scorn. Today was no different. Charles's disdain was written plainly on his face for everyone to see. "Pirate, why won't you kneel before your king?" demanded the white-haired minister, finger trembling as he jabbed the air in Charles's direction. Charles glanced up coolly. At that moment, the gray-haired minister beside him turned ashen, clearly unnerved by Charles's impassive aura. "There isn't a single soul in this world worthy of my kneeling," Charles said, voice low and mocking. "Not even Rox himself. Do you truly think I'd genuflect to a boy on a throne?" Fury flared on the ministers' faces. Dozens of them raised fingers, each accusing, each demanding Charles's obedience. Then, in the blink of an eye, a silver streak of light cut through the hall. The 7-star sword sang as it leapt from its sheath, and one by one, the men who dared point at Charles crumpled to the marble floor in pools of blood. An eerie silence fell, as though the entire court collectively held its breath. Charles sheathed his sword with a single, effortless motion. He surveyed the fallen with an indifferent shrug, then allowed a faint, wry smile to touch his lips. "Ah," he said, voice calm as a summer breeze. "It's nice to finally have someone pointing at me." Silence fell over the throne room. No one dared look up. Everyone recoiled before Charles's formidable display of power and violence. Only the young king watched him with keen interest, unflinching in the face of Charles's fearsome reputation. Charles met his gaze, and with a half-threat, half-reminder, called out, "Your Majesty, if you intend to reward me, please do so now. I have no wish to slaughter anyone else here." The king said nothing for a moment. Then he gave a slight wave of his hand. 5 trembling handmaidens stepped forward, each bearing a lacquered box. "Open them," the king commanded softly. At his order, the maids lifted their lids in unison. One by one, 5 devil fruits, each unlike any other, floated free of their boxes, their strange shapes and swirling colors glinting in the torchlight. Charles's eyes lit up. He studied the fruits in turn. 2 of them were unmistakable. One, the long-rumored fusion fruit tied to the future great warrior Barrett. The other, the rare natural devil fruit, known simply as the swamp fruit. Suspicion flickered across Charles's face. He glanced up at the king, unwilling to believe his lie, that the monarch was unaware he'd presented him with such a coveted natural fruit. The king met his look and offered a courteous smile. "Mr. Charles, are you satisfied?" Charles chuckled as he snapped the last box shut. "Perfect. Absolutely perfect." He flashed a grin at the king. Even if only 2 of these were genuine devil fruits, that was more than enough. The other 3 could be worthless trinkets. I'd still call this a job well done. The king gave an approving nod. Charles gathered the 5 boxes in his arms and felt a wave of relief wash over him. This haul had been lucrative, and best of all, no one from the Rocks pirates would ever suspect a thing. Truth be told, Locke himself probably wouldn't care. These days, the legendary Rocks were more a shadow of their former selves. In their heyday, officers were forced to turn over 70% of their plunder to Locke. Now, hardly anyone handed over more than 30%. With a satisfied smile, Charles bowed. "My reward has been received. I will take my leave now. May your kingdom prosper." The king returned the bow, his face alight with gratitude. "Your words honor us, Lord Charles. Please allow our attendants to see you out." As the court attendant stepped forward, Tang En, who had stewed in silence without daring to speak, finally exhaled, relief softening his shoulders. Charles stood motionless amid the carnage, his sword still slick with blood. Dozens of Wuzhou ministers lay sprawled at his feet. He stared blankly at the floor, his heart pounding, terrified that his own fury might have claimed the king's life as well. Yet against all odds, the next moment unfolded without a hitch. Tang En let out a soft sigh of relief and stepped forward. "Mr. Charles, please." Charles lifted 5 lacquered boxes, each one rumored to hold a devil fruit. As he advanced, the tension in the grand hall dissolved in an instant. Ministers who had trembled at his approach now exhaled collectively. From the throne, the young king allowed himself a genuine smile. A herald cleared his throat and proclaimed the new royal decree, formally sealing their victory over the Wuzhou kingdom. With the announcement complete, Charles turned to leave the hall, the boxes cradled carefully in his arms. In the corridor beyond, Paul and Isaac rushed over, eyes wide. "Boss!" they chorused. Paul pointed at the boxes. "Are those all devil fruits?" Isaac's voice trembled with excitement. "Legends say most sailors never see even one in their lifetime, and here we have 5, plus the others we picked up earlier." Charles caught himself smiling at their astonishment. In that moment, the promise and peril of these rare treasures lay heavy in the air, hinting at adventures yet to come. Altogether, there were 8 devil fruits. None of them had ever laid eyes on such a haul before, and they all stared in astonishment at the piled-up fruits. Chapter 118, The King of Usury. The ships are all ready. Charles ignored the envious glances around him and called out to the crew. "Did we restock all our supplies?" "It's done, Captain. We can set sail whenever you give the word," Isaac reported, beaming. "That's excellent. Let's head back. Locke must have been waiting for ages." Cradling the devil fruit in his arms, Charles strode toward the dock. His companions followed in his wake. Tang En watched their retreating figures for a moment, let out a soft sigh, and then turned back toward the palace. Aboard the flagship, row after row of chests and crates were hauled up the gangplank. When the tally was complete, the ledger showed more than 30 billion in gold coins, and that didn't even count the 8 rare devil fruits they'd secured. Even seasoned hands like Elena gasped at the sight. Charles slipped an arm around her waist and grinned. "Believe me, I've seen even greater hauls than this. It's just another day's work." Elena's cheeks flushed as she froze in his embrace. She had long since accepted Charles as her husband, but such bold affection was still a new sensation. Her pulse quickened, and for a heartbeat, the treasure spread out before them might as well have been dust. Charles didn't care at all. He simply pulled Elena into a tight embrace. "Let go! Let go! Everyone's watching," she protested, her cheeks flaming. Elena's soft voice trailed off as Charles flashed a grin and swept his gaze over the assembled crew. "Who dares to stare?" he teased. "I'll kiss them until they can't look away." Obligingly, every face on deck turned away, Panis and Barrett included. With a flourish, Charles pressed a quick kiss to Elena's cheek. She froze, then jerked free and scampered into the cabin, mortified and muttering under her breath. Charles watched her retreat, a satisfied smile on his lips. "All right, everyone, next stop, Hive Island," he called out. He hoisted 5 heavy crates filled with devil fruits and disappeared below deck. Behind him, the crew exchanged amused glances. Our boss has zero shame, one sailor muttered. If I looked like him, I'd hide from my own mother. Paul glared after Charles with a mixture of envy and irritation. Suddenly, wham! A shockwave burst from the cabin door, slamming Paul to the deck. Keep your mouth shut. A thunderous voice warned from within. I'll cut out your tongue, he snarled. With a sharp whistle, he vanished in an instant, and the sudden gust of wind sent Paul tumbling over the ship's rail and into the frothing sea. Isaac sprinted to the railing, peering down at Paul as he flailed in the water. Ha! That should shut you up, Isaac jeered, laughter rolling off him. Pull me up, you bastard. Paul sputtered, teeth chattering. Isaac shrugged, tossed a coiled rope over the side, and watched as Paul gripped it tightly and hauled himself back aboard. Meanwhile, Charles made his way back to the captain's quarters, half expecting Elena to be gone, and sure enough, she was. He wasn't surprised. Carefully, he tucked the 5 wooden chests into a hidden compartment. Inside lay 3 devil fruits, prized and perilous. The other 3, shaped like peculiar bananas, told him at least 5 of the 8 fruits belonged to the zoan, or animal, category. Apparently, no one from the animal department had managed to spirit theirs away. Sitting on his narrow berth, Charles felt the gentle roll of the ship beneath him as they slipped away from the island's port. He stared up at the ceiling, replaying the recent chaos in his mind, the bluster, the betrayals, the thunder of clashing wills. Now they were gone, leaving behind a land long mired in conflict. Maybe, he thought, the title of Country of Endless War would finally be laid to rest. Several days had passed since Charles departed the Endless War state, and the news of his exploits finally reached the Navy's highest echelons. Word spread that the boy who'd emerged in the New World had single-handedly toppled 5 kingdoms in rapid succession. Inside Navy headquarters, Admiral Sora, his left arm wrapped in bandages, slammed his fist onto the desk. "Explain this to me again," he barked. "Charles destroyed 5 kingdoms after arriving in the New World? How dare he?" Across the room, Steelbone Kong, still recovering from recent sword wounds, pounded his own desk in frustration. "General, the report comes directly from the G6 branch in the New World, and CP0 of the world government has officially confirmed it." The young messenger, new to the post but unflappable, met their angry stares without flinching. Sora leaned forward, eyes blazing. "Then raise the bounty. Make it 11 billion berries. The public demands an answer, and we'll let the entire world hunt him down." Steelbone Kong nodded grimly. Unable to dispatch naval forces into the New World themselves, they would rely on the lure of an unprecedented reward and the promise of vengeance against the runaway prodigy named Charles. Steelbone Kong slammed his fist on the desk. "Hold on," he barked. "Get that table replaced and this office cleaned up. Now!" "Yes, sir." The orderly snapped to attention, darting from the room. Kong watched him go, irritation pricking at his nerves. His previous assistant had been transferred without warning, and this new one was green as spring grass, asking questions about everything, forcing Kong to explain even the simplest orders. He'd have to petition for someone more competent soon enough. But first, he had to deal with the fallout from Charles. Reports were flooding in that the boy, rumored to be a mere upstart, had ambushed nearly 24 of their operatives in the Endless War's territory. Meanwhile, in a fortified villa on a remote island of the New World, Dufeld, the underworld's top loan shark, paced before a panoramic window. His open comlink crackled again. "What did you just report?" Dufeld's voice cut through the static. "Charles killed our men in endless wars? 20 of them, wasn't it? How is that even possible, and why would he do it?" He gripped the edge of the console so hard his knuckles whitened. He'd sunk billions of pelli into those warring nations, investments meant to reap even greater profits. Now his capital lay in ruins thanks to a single, reckless boy. Anger roiled through him, but when he slammed his fist down, it felt as hollow as the empty chair across from him. He exhaled, his rage draining into dark resignation. What good was fury if it couldn't bring back his money, or his men? Feld stared at the data scroll on his desk and shook his head. There was simply no way he could defeat Charles. Ever since Charles's rise to become captain of Rox's 8th Squadron, he had proven himself one of the strongest fighters in the entire New World. Worse still, Charles answered directly to Rox himself, the supreme overlord of this realm. No one in their right mind would dare cross him. As a seasoned businessman, Feld never took risks that didn't line his pockets. Picking up his comlink, he tapped a few coordinates and waited. 2 tones later, the call was answered. "Feld, you sly shark. Long time no hear," came a familiar, amused voice. "Xiachi," Feld replied, smoothing his words into practiced courtesy. "I trust you're well." "Better than ever," Xiachi chuckled. "But let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want from me?" Feld allowed himself a faint smile. "I need contact information for Charles, the captain of Rox's 8th Squadron. If you can get me his coordinates and official channels, I'll make it worth your while." There was a pause on the other end. Then Xiachi's low laugh returned. "Charles, huh? That's a tall order. You know how tightly Rox guards his people." "I do," Feld said evenly, "but you and I both know I don't ask without reason. I'm prepared to compensate you handsomely for this favor." Another quiet moment. Finally, Xiachi sighed. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up, but this won't come cheap, Feld." "Agreed," Feld said. "Name your price." He ended the call and leaned by Sakai, confident that once he'd secured Charles's direct line, the rest of his plan would fall neatly into place. After all, in the New World, information was the most valuable currency of all. Chapter 119, The King of Killers. Xiachi's phone buzzed on the table. She frowned when she saw Feld's name flash on the screen. Hadn't he been indifferent toward Charles until now? Why was he suddenly calling? She answered on the second ring. "Yes?" On the other end, Feld's calm voice asked, "You want Charles's contact info? Why?" Xiachi blinked. "Well," she cleared her throat, my people accidentally offended him. I need to apologize in person." "Offended him?" Feld echoed, sounding amused. "How did you manage that?" I'm not at liberty to say." She waved away the detail. "All I know is that he took it badly, so I have to smooth things over myself. Can you give me his number?" A brief silence. Then Feld said, "Sure, but information isn't free. 5 billion berries." 5 billion? Xiachi's breath caught. She slammed her palm down. "Deal." It wasn't her first time cutting a check for an outrageous price. That Feld was rumored to control more assets than most slaver barons. He even had the chief intelligence officer of the Rox pirates on his payroll, plus their navigator. 5 billion berries was pocket change to a loan shark of his caliber. "Wire it to account 0927, Feld instructed. "Once it clears, I'll send you what you want." "Understood." Xiachi suppressed a smile. She hung up and tapped out a message to her finance department. "Transfer 5,000 berries to Feld Enterprises ASAP." Within minutes, confirmation pinged back. She flipped her phone open just as Feld's message arrived. "Charles Wu, 008-556-129. Good luck." Xiachi tucked her phone away and let out a satisfied sigh. Finally, a chance to explain, if not excuse, her team's blunder. Meanwhile, miles across the Grand Line, Charles checked his own messages as he leaned against the railing of his ship. The name Xiachi on his screen made him pause. This would be interesting. And somewhere deep in the underworld, Feld leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The King of Killers was about to have an unexpected visitor. He allowed himself a small predatory grin. End of chapter. "I'll give you Charles's number right now," Xiachi said with forced cheer, though in her heart she muttered about undercutting her price. Feld, the only sensible one of the lot, had come specifically to get Charles's contact, and Xiachi didn't hesitate to hand it over. Not everyone was as level-headed as Feld, however. Some people still believed they were untouchable. "What are you talking about?" "Charles, the captain of the 8th Squadron of the Rock Pirates, just wiped out one of our most vital resource-producing nations." The voice on the other end, Dorag Peck, one of the 6 emperors of the Dark World, erupted in fury. "Is that confirmed?" "Absolutely, boss," his subordinate's reply crackled back. "The stronghold in the Endless Wars nation was razed. Our raw materials are gone, and every last person is dead." Peck slammed his fist onto the communications console, rattling the datapads strewn across it. Since when had anyone dared pull off such a devastating strike against his interests? He slammed the phone back to his ear. "Are you certain it was Charles?" "Positive, sir. Who else wields the power of a great swordsman, aside from him?" With a harsh click, the call ended. Peak pressed both hands to his temples, rage coiling through his veins until his knuckles shone white. No, he snarled under his breath, eyes flashing crimson. I will not let this stand. Dragopiek's fists beat against the polished mahogany table, rattling glasses and papers. I'll have my revenge, he snarled. Otherwise everyone will see my King of Killers title as a joke. He reached for the antique telephone at his elbow. Listen up, he barked into the receiver. Broadcast this immediately. Rockefeller Charles, captain of the 8th Squad of the Rocks Pirates, carries a bounty of 20 billion berries in the underworld, dead or alive. Within moments, the underworld was set ablaze by the announcement. Crime lords, assassins, and pirate hunters alike erupted in whispered frenzy. What is Piek thinking? One grumbled. Doesn't he realize he's daring the new world's strongest? In his private chamber, Dufeld slammed the parchment to the desk and sprang to his feet. He had never expected Dragopiek to be so audacious. A 20 billion bounty on Charles? It was outright madness. Far away in Happy Street, newly crowned Queen Stussy arched an amused brow as her messenger read the decree aloud. When the final line fell silent, she leaned back on her velvet throne and let out a soft, playful laugh. Fascinating, she murmured. I'm very curious to see what Charles did to drive Piek to this. Prepare my carriage. We're going to do a little reconnaissance. Her attendants bowed and hurried from the room, eager to discover exactly why the fearless captain of the Rocks Pirates had become the most wanted man in the underworld. Yes, Stussy murmured, watching his men withdraw in perfect formation. He paused for a moment, then pressed a concealed button on his phone and placed the call. Across the line, Morgans, Kibson, and Umit, freshly elevated to their new positions, stared at the classified data flooding their screens. None of them spoke for several tense seconds, until Morgans finally let out a low whistle. Piek really went through with it, didn't he? Meanwhile, Charles had no idea about the power plays swirling around him. His full attention was on Barrett. Ever since Barrett set foot on the ship, he'd been utterly captivated by Charles's reputation for raw strength. Whenever he found a spare moment, he raced to Charles's private training room and threw himself at the equipment like a man possessed. Dumbbells, barbells, cable machines. Barrett attacked every station with relentless focus. If it weren't for his youth and still maturing muscles, Barrett might have kept lifting for 4 or 5 hours straight. Instead, he'd finally collapse from sheer exhaustion long before his body gave out. Charles leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching the whirlwind of energy. This kid's a monster, he muttered. Paul hovered nearby, arms crossed. He sighed, rolling his eyes. Monster calls monster, he murmured under his breath. Charles couldn't help but chuckle, but he also felt a twinge of concern. Barrett's workouts, while awe-inspiring, were completely unstructured, and that only risked injury. He stepped into the room, resting a hand on Barrett's shoulder as the younger man lowered his final set of dumbbells. Barrett looked up, sweat beading on his brow, and offered a sheepish grin. I've got to train harder, Barrett panted. That drive is impressive, Charles said, guiding him toward a bench. But you need a system. You're burning out your gains by training like this. He paused, then pulled a slim binder from his duffel. Here, this is the Navy's 6th Combat Training Protocol. It outlines a balanced regimen, strength work, endurance drills, recovery. If you study it and follow the plan, you'll get stronger and stay healthy. Barrett accepted the binder with wide eyes. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Charles smiled. Good. Let's get you on a proper schedule. He nodded to Paul, who set a timer. As Barrett prepared for his first structured set, Charles felt confident he'd forged not just a student, but a true trainee, someone who could match his own strength through discipline as well as willpower. Charles realized he still hadn't a clear roadmap for Barrett's future. To stay true to the original story, he needed to gift Barrett a combined devil fruit, one that would amplify his already staggering strength. Scratching his chin, he surveyed the 8 devil fruits now in his care. Only 2 had been positively identified. The rest would have to wait until they returned to Hive Island. He recalled Barrett's phenomenal physique in the original novel and knew an animal-type zone fruit would suit him perfectly, provided it was a mythical zone. Anything less wouldn't do justice to Barrett's raw power. First on his mind was the mythical model Azure Dragon, formerly Kaido's fruit. It remained under the custody of Charles and Lingling, but getting hold of it would be exceedingly difficult. Then there was the Yamata no Orochi fruit, another tempting option if Blackbeard hadn't already claimed it. If that path proved blocked, he'd have to hatch a more elaborate scheme. The phoenix fruit also held tremendous promise, though its location was unknown. And finally, there was Yamato's future true kami fruit, the Uowo no Mi, model Kawaguchi, rumored to be somewhere in Wano country, a lead he could afford to investigate later. Which of these legendary fruits would best complement Barrett's power? Charles knew he'd have to act quickly and wisely. Charles lounged on the quarterdeck, staring out at the endless blue sea. Rumors had reached his ears of a human fruit phantom beast devil fruit evolving into Tau form somewhere in Wano country, and of a vampire beast fruit still lying dormant in an ancient town. Both treasures, he knew, would be theirs once they slipped free of the Rock's pirates. He intended to stow away the most potent devil fruit for a rainy day. After all, by the time Lu Fei struck out on his own, he'd be well into his 60s, hardly young enough to forge a new legacy without some supernatural edge. Most phantom beast devil fruits were said to hide in Wano, Charles mused. As soon as they had a moment, he'd chart a course for those fabled shores. He dipped his head, mapping out strategies in his mind. Barrett, sensing his captain's deep thought, hung back on the deck, content to watch and occasionally pound his fist in eager anticipation. Minutes passed in silence before Charles let out a slow, deliberate breath. "Barrett," he said, finally looking up, "you choose which devil fruit you want. I've got my sights on something special." He allowed himself a wry smile. "And remember, combined devil fruits can be devastating. Master them right, and you could wield up to 6 different powers, just like the old legends describe." At the thought of all those hidden fruits waiting to be claimed, Charles felt a familiar thrill. His pulse quickened with the promise of power, and with it, the burning desire to break free from the Rock's pirates' shadow. This was only the beginning. The Rock's pirates were tightening their grip on him more and more each day. "Valley of the Gods, come swiftly," Charles murmured, excitement gleaming in his eyes. Chapter 120, The 6 Great Emperors of the Dark World. Time drifted past as Charles drilled Barrett in swordsmanship and strategy. All the while, their 2-masted ship pressed steadily toward Beehive Island. With every passing league, more pirate vessels swooped into view, like sharks drawn to blood. Since Charles had kept his true colors hidden, these marauders believed they'd found an easy mark. Suddenly, a battered sloop bore down on them, its deck crawling with cutlasses and snarling buccaneers. Charles braced, then in one fluid motion slashed at its hull. With a thunderous crack, the enemy ship sheared in half, splinters flying and pirates plunging into the sea. Sheathing his blade, Charles called up from the quarterdeck, "Hoist our flag! Let's clear these flies off our decks." Paul, the helmsman, leapt forward and hauled down the blank canvas they'd kept hidden. Seconds later, the skull and crossbones of the Rock's pirates snapped open in the wind. The effect was instantaneous. Every pirate vessel in sight faltered, then turned tail and fled. Who would dare tangle with the Rock's pirates, overlords of the New World's darkest seas? It wasn't an idle boast. Among the Rock's pirates' ranks were 6 legendary captains, known across every ocean as the 6 Great Emperors of the Dark World. Each one, alone, possessed enough firepower to level a small island. And with the formidable twins, Heitan and Muchan, newly returned to their banner, the fleet's reputation had only grown more dread-inspiring. No scurvy dog in his right mind would stand and fight. Charles watched the last pirate sloop vanish over the horizon, then nodded toward the companionway. "Barrett, back to your lessons. We've still got a long voyage to Beehive Island, and I want you ready for whatever we find there." Below deck, Barrett wiped sweat from his brow and grinned. Above them, the sun shone on the black flag of the Rock's pirates as their flagship surged onward, an unchallenged leviathan bound for the heart of the Dark World. Charles stepped into the cabin and nearly tripped over a shrill ring, his hidden phone line lighting up with an unfamiliar number. Who would be calling at this hour? He frowned, lifted the handset and said coolly, "Who is this?" On the other end, Dufeld, rumored throughout the underworld as the Lone Shark King, stammered in surprise. My apologies for the intrusion, Lord Charles. This is Dufeld, the usurer king of the Dark Realm. I offer you my salutations." Charles paused, recalling nothing of this self-styled title. Until now, he'd treated Dufeld's name as just another rumor. Businessman or criminal mastermind, what did he want with Charles? Yet he recognized the voice's forced politeness, the practiced charm of a financier used to cajoling debtors. Loan Shark King? He repeated, arching an eyebrow. I'm not sure I follow. Dufeld cleared his throat and lowered his voice, careful and conciliatory. My lord, I'm calling to apologize for my subordinate's misconduct, not long ago, during your campaign in the Endless Wars Kingdom. I understand your men clashed with ours, and, regrettably, some of my clients were killed. A shadow passed over Charles's mind as he remembered the brutal siege of Dufeld's fortress and the cutthroats who'd ambushed his troops. Those men were the usurer's pawns, and he'd left their bodies scattered in the ruins. He pressed his lips together. You have an interesting way of doing business, he said evenly. Perhaps next time you'd think twice before sending hired thugs after me. No, my lord, Dufeld said hastily. It won't happen again. Consider this a formal apology from the Dark Realm's coffers. Charles held up a hand, cutting him off. He stared into the dim cabin light, weighing his options. He didn't need another enemy, but an ally, even an unscrupulous one like Dufeld, could prove useful. Keep your apology, he said at last. Let's see how you back it up. He hung up without waiting for a reply, pocketed the handset and turned to face the cabin's lone window. Outside, the night stretched on, but the balance of power had just shifted. Charles barely glanced at Dufeld as the merchant made yet another apology. His tone was polite, almost ingratiating. I'm truly sorry for my earlier rudeness. I hope you'll forgive me. Charles shrugged, voice cool. Save it. I don't care, and honestly, I don't even remember those people you offended. He'd learned to enjoy dealing with Type A personalities who tried and failed to rattle him. Seeing his indifference only made Dufeld more eager. He straightened, flashing a conciliatory smile. In that case, let me make it up to you. Next time you need a loan, I'll offer you my lowest interest rate, no questions asked. Charles lifted an eyebrow. A low-interest loan? He had no problem borrowing money. After all, in his previous life, crushing debts had driven him into mercenary work for a friend's dodgy scheme. He'd fled abroad to escape those obligations, and he never intended to settle them. Sounds great, he said, offering a mock salute. I'll be sure to take you up on it. Dufeld's grin widened. Splendid. I'll await the opportunity. His tone then shifted, growing grave. He leaned in close, voice hushed. There's something else you should know. Consider it a free tip. You've just toppled the Endless Wars Kingdom and restored peace there. But word travels fast in the underworld. Peak, the self-styled king of assassins, is furious. He's put a bounty of 20 billion credits on your head. At that, Charles's expression darkened. 20 billion credits. Every cutthroat and hired blade from here to the frontier would see him as the richest prize in Gutland. He clenched his jaw. Well, he muttered, that certainly spares me from boredom. Charles stared at his phone in disbelief. So he hates me because I destroyed the country of endless wars? Feld's voice crackled through the line, brimming with dark amusement. Hate. He's offered a 20 billion berry bounty on your head. That's more than hate. That's a declaration of war. Heh! And he isn't just any pirate. He's known as the King of Assassins, boss of that notorious funeral syndicate, specializing in organ trafficking. Tell me, Charles, where else could the four emperors find more bloodshed? At that moment, everything clicked into place. No wonder one of the world's most feared figures wanted him dead. Charles felt a surge of disgust. You people from the underworld are utterly revolting, he spat. Feld laughed softly. I'll take that as a compliment. Before the killer could retort, Charles slammed down the phone, cutting off the jesting mercenary. From the other end, Feld only shrugged when he heard the busy signal. A sound of relief passed his lips. This matter was settled. Now all he could do was sit back and watch the chaos unfold. Charles collapsed onto his narrow bunk. His mind raced with possibilities and dangers. If one emperor already considered him a sworn enemy, how many more would put a price on his life? In the unpredictable world of pirates and power, surviving meant staying one step ahead of those who would kill him for glory or revenge. Charles had always been drawn to the underbelly of the world, a vast network of illegal trades and shadowy dealings collectively known as the Dark World. Here, Every forbidden activity had its own emperor, a ruler who reigned supreme over a single illicit domain. Charles paused at the entrance of a dimly lit tavern whose patrons ranged from grizzled smugglers to furtive information brokers. He closed his eyes and let the muffled din settle into his memories. First among them was Dufeld, the undisputed king of usury. In the currency field, he held absolute sway. No one in the dark world lent money or demanded repayment except him. His sprawling financial empire thrived on relentless interest, and his agents circulated through every port, every back-alley exchange. Those who failed to meet his terms soon discovered that Dufeld's generosity ended where pain began. Then there was Stussy, the enigmatic Queen of Happy Street. To most, she appeared as a high-rolling socialite, hosting exclusive gatherings where laughter and wine flowed without restraint. But in Charles's mind, her facade always hinted at something darker. He'd heard whispers that she was a CP0 intelligence officer, working directly under the Celestial Dragons. Rumors went further still, that she was a cloned prodigy of one Barkingham Stussy, a former member of the legendary Rocks Pirates. Even more astonishing was the talk that she served as a deep-cover spy for Vegapunk himself, an intellect unmatched in gathering secrets and twisting them to her advantage. Finally came Dorag Piccolo, known throughout the Dark World as the Grandmaster of the Killer Fields. His reputation was carved in bone and blood. Standing well over 6 feet tall, he towered in a tattered funeral cloak, his mane of hair fanning out like a savage halo. A grotesque, clownish mask hid his face, and he carried at his side a scythe as black as midnight. Where he walked, death and contract killings followed, and none dared cross him. These 3 emperors shaped the hidden markets of the world. Each controlled a realm that fed on desperation, money for the indebted, distraction for the bored, and violence for the vengeful. And Charles, standing in that shadowed corner, knew all too well that crossing paths with any one of them could change a life forever. As the tavern's door creaked open, he squared his shoulders and stepped inside, ready to test just how deep the dark world's tendrils truly went. In a world where power dictates the balance between life and death, 4 emperors reigned supreme, each master of a brutal clandestine trade. One ambitious young man, Charles, dreams of standing among them. To do so, he must first understand the ruthless domains they control. The Emperor of Intelligence. Morgan's known throughout the globe as Big News. Morgan sits at the pinnacle of information warfare. He is the president of the World Economic News Agency, and his devil fruit ability, Tori Tori no Mi, model Albatross, lets him soar unseen to any breaking story. Wherever chaos erupts, Morgan's is on the scene, snapping photos and extracting secrets. He commands legions of paparazzi and informants with near omnipresent reach, making him both a formidable spy and a relentless assassin in the shadows. The Emperor of Organ Trade. Ruthless beyond measure, this emperor oversees a hidden network of assassins and organ brokers. Lives are taken as commodities, body parts bought and sold in surgical backrooms. No ledger is kept, no soul spared. Cruelty is their currency, and fear their most lucrative asset. The Emperor of Storage. Firmly established as the hidden master, Gibson runs the old warehouse storage conglomerate. From the outside, his facilities look decades out of date, rusting metal doors, faded signage, and an ever-present scent of stale ale Gibson likes to drink. Behind those unassuming walls, however, lies a vault of contraband, luxury weapons, black market artifacts, and forbidden goods. Gibson's reputation for secrecy is unmatched. Once something enters his warehouses, it vanishes from every register and radar. The Emperor of Transport. Umit revered as the deep ocean current, Umit holds a monopoly over maritime shipping lanes. His fleet of sleek cargo vessels slips through pirate-infested waters and naval blockades alike, delivering goods or weapons anywhere on Earth's seas. No port is beyond his reach, no contract too dangerous. With a single command, he can crush rival fleets or smuggle entire armies across oceans under the radar of every coast guard. Charles studies their exploits in hushed tones, aware that to challenge even one emperor would demand more than courage. It would require outwitting the world's most formidable powers. And yet, as the waves of intrigue and violence swirl around him, he cannot ignore the thrill of the chase. His journey is only beginning. He looked every bit the classic pirate, an old man with a thick, tangled beard and weathered skin. Yet the Sea King was also the first dark power Charles ever encountered. Long before Charles set foot on Kame Island, the Sea King had been using it as a way station for his shipments. Today, Kame Island bustles with life, its docks crowded with merchants and cargo in constant transit. Charles visits often, and under his vigilant protection, few pirates dare threaten the island.